Hey. Welcome back to Harryverse X. We've got something fire today. DIO found Harry in cupboard at age 4 and vampire time stop made him immortal god of frozen time. Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1, The Cupboard and the King. The summer of 1984 smelled like petrol and cut grass on Privet Drive, and DIO walked through it like a man who owned the night, which, in every meaningful sense, he did. He had no particular reason to be in Surrey. That was the honest answer, and DIO had always appreciated honesty when it served him. He had been moving through England for 3 weeks, testing distances, mapping the limits of his presence, watching how ordinary humans arranged their small lives in their small houses along their small streets. It amused him in the way that an anthill amuses a man with a magnifying glass, not cruelty exactly, just the casual acknowledgement of disproportion. Little Whinging was exactly the kind of place people ended up when they stopped wanting anything. The houses were identical. The lawns were identical. Even the parked cars seemed to have reached some democratic consensus about acceptable colors. Beige. Gray. One brave soul had gone with a dusty blue, and DIO had noted the address simply because someone on this street had once, at least briefly, possessed a preference. He walked with his hands loose at his sides and his coat trailing behind him, and none of the few people still awake at this hour looked out their windows. They didn't decide not to look. The decision was simply removed from them, gently, the way you'd close a door in a room where someone was sleeping. DIO was not in the mood for witnesses. He had been thinking about time. This was not unusual. He had been thinking about time for years, about Za Warudo, about the sensation of reaching into the machinery of the universe and simply stopping it, like pressing your thumb against the mainspring of a watch. The power had grown since his transformation. It had deepened in ways that still, even now, produced in him something he might reluctantly describe as wonder. 10 seconds of stop time had become 30. 30 had become a minute. The limit, if one existed, was somewhere he hadn't yet touched, and the pursuit of that limit was one of the only things that still felt like genuine curiosity rather than boredom. He was 3 houses past number 4 when he stopped walking. It was not a sound. It was not a smell, though his senses were sharp enough to catch both, the faint salt ammonia of malnourishment, the old wood smell of an enclosed space. What stopped him was something else. Something he had no word for in any language he spoke, and he spoke many. It was like standing next to a generator that was running on the wrong kind of fuel. A vibration that didn't match its container. DIO turned and looked at number 4, Privet Drive. An ordinary house. An ordinary door, painted an aggressively cheerful shade of red. A car in the driveway that suggested the owner was aggressively ordinary in all his choices and quite proud of it. A letterbox. A doormat. A garden with roses arranged with the kind of rigid symmetry that spoke of a homeowner who controlled the things that would tolerate being controlled. And beneath the staircase, because he could feel it now that he was paying attention, feel it the way you feel a draft and then find the gap, something that pulsed. He stood on the pavement for a moment and considered the situation. Then he walked up the front path. The lock on the front door was cheap and asked no questions. He stepped inside and stood in the dark hallway and let his eyes adjust to the additional darkness, which took no time at all. The house was asleep. Upstairs, 2 adults, one unconscious with the particular heaviness of a man who'd eaten too much and drunk slightly more than was visible. One child, large for its age even in sleep, sprawled diagonally across a bed with the aggressive territoriality of children who've never been told there are limits. Normal people. He dismissed them without cruelty and without interest and turned his attention to the cupboard. It was latched from the outside with 2 bolts. 2 bolts, on a cupboard door, inside a house. DIO looked at this for a moment and felt something shift in his expression, though the hallway was too dark for it to matter. He drew the bolts. He opened the door. The smell hit him first, not terrible, but wrong. The particular wrongness of a small space that was cleaned reluctantly and infrequently. A single blanket. A broken toy soldier. A child's drawing taped crookedly to the slanted wall, a green blob and a brown stick and a yellow circle that was clearly the sun, the universal first subject of children who've been given a crayon. And in the corner, on the thin blanket, a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 4. Dark hair sticking out at every angle, the way hair behaves when someone cuts it functionally rather than kindly. An overlarge shirt that had started its life belonging to someone else. And even in sleep, the thing that made DIO go very still, even in sleep the boy's face had the particular quality of someone who was alert. The brows slightly contracted. The hands half curled. Asleep but ready, in the way of creatures that have learned that sleep is a risk. DIO had looked in mirrors for years and seen nothing. He was not sentimental about this. But standing over this child, this 4-year-old in a cupboard with 2 bolts on the outside, he felt the uncomfortable precision of recognition. And beneath all of that, beneath the dim, unwilling flicker of something he refused to name, the pulse was here. Coming from the boy. Coming from him the way heat comes from a coal that's been buried under ash, invisible at the surface but present at a depth that the ash could not contain forever. DIO crouched down. He brought his face level with the sleeping child's and studied him the way he studied things that interested him, which was to say without mercy and without hurry. The boy's magic, because that's what it was, he recognized the shape of it now, had encountered witches and wizards before and found them tedious in their limitations. The boy's magic was enormous. It was the size of something that had no business being in a 4-year-old body. Like finding a river running underneath a garden. Like discovering that the modest hill outside a city was actually a mountain that had agreed, temporarily, to lie down. But it wasn't the size that held DIO's attention. Size was common enough. Power came in large quantities to many people and most of them did nothing interesting with it. It was the quality. There was something in this child's magic that resonated, that was the only word, with Zawarudo. With the sensation of stop time. As if the boy had been born already leaning in the direction of stillness, of that perfect arrested moment between 1 second and the next. As if whatever he was, whatever he would become, was already oriented toward the thing DIO had spent years mastering. DIO stayed crouched for a long time. Then the boy opened his eyes. They were green. The very specific green of someone who had been born exceptional and had not yet been told to be embarrassed about it. The boy looked up at DIO with no particular fear, with the steady, assessing gaze of a child who had already learned that fear was expensive and information was cheap. He looked at DIO the way you look at a new thing and wait to see what it does. "Hello," the boy said. His voice was still rough with sleep and very quiet, with the practiced quietness of someone who'd learned that the wrong noise brought consequences. DIO studied him for another moment. "Hello," he said. "You're not supposed to be in here," the boy said, which was remarkable for any number of reasons, the most notable being that he said it as an observation rather than an accusation, and that it applied at least as much to himself as to DIO. "Neither are you," DIO said. The boy considered this. He sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around himself with a dignity that was, frankly, impressive given the circumstances. "I live here," he said. Then, quietly, sort of. "What's your name?" "Harry," said the boy. "Harry Potter." DIO sat back on his heels and looked at this child who lived sort of in a cupboard with 2 bolts on the outside, whose magic pulsed against the walls of its container like something that already knew it was eventually going to win, and made a decision. He had made decisions before. He had made decisions that moved countries, that ended lives, that redirected the flow of history with the casual efficiency of a man rerouting a stream. He made decisions without sentiment and without second-guessing because second-guessing was a habit for people who doubted themselves and DIO had not doubted himself in years. This decision was different in texture but not in weight. He had made it, he realized, before he had finished opening the cupboard door. "Harry Potter," he said. "I'm going to give you something." Harry watched him without moving. "What kind of something?" "The kind," DIO said, "that cannot be taken away." He didn't explain further. Explanation was for people who needed permission. He reached out and placed one hand, carefully, which was not a word that normally applied to him, against the side of the boy's head, and he reached for Zawarudo. Not the full invocation. Not the declaration, not the sensation of the world slamming to a halt and the golden silence descending. Something deeper than that. The root of it. The place in himself where the ability lived not as a technique but as a nature, a fundamental quality of what he had become. He reached for the essence of stop time, the part of him that existed in the gap between one moment and the next, and he pressed it forward. The effect was immediate and completely silent. The air in the cupboard changed. The shadows deepened into something that was almost a color, a non-color, the shade of between. Harry's eyes went wide, not with fear but with the expression of someone hearing music for the first time and recognizing instinctively that they have always been able to hear it, that the silence before this moment was absence, not baseline. DIO felt it take. Felt it lock into place the way a bone feels when it resets, wrong pressure, then rightness, then permanence. The boy's magic, which had been enormous and unfocused, contracted sharply and then exploded outward, and for one fraction of a second every clock within 100 meters stopped. Every clock on Privet Drive. Every watch on every wrist. Every microwave display, every oven timer, every alarm clock waiting patiently on every identical bedside table in every identical bedroom. They stopped. And Harry Potter, 4 years old and sitting in a cupboard in a too large shirt, breathed in, breathed out, and glowed, briefly, faintly, with the golden light of something that no longer had a word for what it was. DIO withdrew his hand. Stood. The clock started again, 17 seconds behind where they should have been. He looked at the boy who looked back at him with those green eyes that now had, if you knew where to look, a faint ring of gold around the pupils. The color of stop time. What was that? Harry asked, and his voice was different now, not louder, not older, just clearer. Like a bell that had been rung once and remembered the note. A beginning, DIO said. Harry looked at his hands. They were the same hands. Small. A scrape on the left knuckle from something recent. The same hands. But when he held them still, really still, the air around them had a quality to it, a waiting quality, like the moment before a word. Will you come back? Harry asked. DIO paused with his hand on the frame of the cupboard door. It was a genuine question, asked with zero emotional manipulation and zero expectation of a particular answer, just the flat, practical inquiry of a child who had already learned not to need things he wasn't sure he was going to get. No, DIO said, because he did not lie to people he respected, and he found, with some surprise, that he respected this boy. Harry nodded once. That was all. He lay back down on his blanket and looked at the ceiling of his cupboard, which was also the underside of the staircase, and his expression said that he was already working with what he'd been given. DIO drew the bolts on the outside of the cupboard door and walked back out into the Surrey night and did not look back, because he was DIO and he was finished here, and what happened next was the boy's to own. He was 3 streets away when he heard, carried on the night air, every dog in Little Whinging begin to bark at once. 6 years is a long time to be anything. It is especially long when you are 4 years old and have just been fundamentally rewritten at the level of what you are. Harry Potter didn't understand what had happened to him. He was 4. Understanding came later, in pieces, the way all real understanding comes, not as revelation but as accumulation. The first piece was small. The morning after the night with the man in the coat, he found that he could make a moment last. Not long. At first not more than a blink, a fraction of a second where everything simply stopped and he hung in the golden silence and then the world fell back into motion and he was the only one who noticed. But a fraction of a second of stop time is still stop time, and Harry was a fast learner with nothing but time and a very small space in which to practice. The Dursleys noticed nothing. This was partly because the Dursleys were committed, world-class noticer of nothings. Vernon Dursley had built a life on the principle that everything unusual was either a hoax, someone else's problem, or both. Petunia Desley had built a life on the principle that anything that threatened the visible perfection of number 4, Privet Drive, did not exist. They had a framework, and reality was expected to fit inside it without complaint. Harry did not fit inside it. He had never fit inside it. He had been their sister's child, dropped on their doorstep with a note, representing everything they had decided not to be: magic, difference, disruption, and their response had been to reduce him. Make him small. Give him the cupboard and the hand-me-downs and the understanding that his name, in this house, was sometimes boy, and sometimes a tone of voice that didn't need a name. He cooked their breakfasts from the age of 5, standing on a step stool because he couldn't reach the hob otherwise. He did the garden. He was Dudley's target, which was a role Dudley committed to with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a child who had been given permission to be his worst self. And every day, in between, Harry practiced. He learned to stop time in increments. 2 seconds. 5. 10. He learned that in stop time he could move and the world couldn't, that he could walk through a frozen moment the way you walk through a room after everyone else has already gone to bed. He learned that it didn't tire him the way running tired him, but that extending it for longer periods produced a feeling in his chest like the moment before lightning, a pressure, a vibration, a sense of imminent release. He stopped Dudley's fist once, at age 6. Just stopped time, stepped sideways out of its path, let the world resume, and watched Dudley's knuckles meet empty air and the boy's expression cycle through confusion and then petulant fury. Harry had kept his face completely neutral. It had been, privately, extremely satisfying. He read everything he could get his hands on. His primary school had a small library and a librarian named Mrs. Fleming who took one look at this strange quiet boy with the bright eyes and the hand-me-down uniform and began, without comment, setting aside books she thought he might like. History. Science. Some mythology. A biography of Nikola Tesla that Harry read 3 times and found deeply reassuring. The idea that a person could be incomprehensible to his contemporaries and still be correct was, at age 7, exactly the narrative he needed. By the time he was 8, he could hold time stopped for nearly a minute. He could do it quietly, without the sensation of pressure, almost casually, the way you hold a breath when you're listening for something. By 9, he had stopped timing it, because a minute had become arbitrary and he was no longer sure the number mattered. What he was, he did not know the word for. He knew he was different. He knew the difference had something to do with the man who had come to his cupboard when he was 4, the tall figure in the coat, the cold hand against his head, the not quite color of the air when it changed. He didn't know the man's name. He had tried looking for him, in the way that a child with no resources and no connections looks for things, which is to say in books, in the shapes of stories, in the descriptions that sometimes surfaced in the stranger sections of the library. He found the word vampire in a mythology section, in a book so old its binding had turned to a kind of structural suggestion rather than an actual spine, and he turned it over in his mind for weeks. He found blood and night and immortality in Stop Time, there in a footnote, there as a reported ability attributed to a class of being the author clearly didn't believe was real. And Harry sat in the school library with the book open in his lap and felt the calm, clean click of a piece landing in its place. He was not a vampire. He knew this in the immediate, physical sense. Sunlight didn't trouble him, he ate normally, his reflection was fully present and, he thought, rather more interesting than Dudley's. But something of the vampire was in him, the way a language lives in a child who was read to in it before they had words of their own. He carried it. It had become native to him. He would find out more when he was older. This was a reasonable plan and Harry was a reasonable person, in the very specific sense that his reasoning was good and he had learned not to waste energy on things that weren't actionable. In the meantime, there were the Desleys. The summer before his 11th birthday was the summer Harry decided he was done being patient. He had been patient for years. Patient was what you were when you were small and resourceless and the costs of impatience were higher than the costs of waiting. Harry understood this at a bone-deep, unsentimental level. He had never confused patience with submission, he just knew when to act and when to watch, and for most of his childhood watching had been the right choice. But he was 10 years old now and would be 11 in July, and the patience had run its course, and Vernon Desley had made the mistake, 3 nights before the Hogwarts letters started arriving, of locking the cupboard from the outside and saying, with the satisfied menace of a man who'd been looking forward to saying it, "You'll stay in there until morning, boy, and if I hear a sound from you." He didn't finish the threat. He usually didn't. The end of the sentence was implied and had always been sufficient. Harry waited until the house was quiet. He waited until he could hear Vernon snoring, the deep, regular thunder of a man who slept without conscience, and Petunia's lighter counterpoint, and Dudley's occasional shifting as he colonized every corner of his enormous bed. He waited until 2 in the morning, by the watch he'd taken from lost property at school and repaired himself, and then he reached up to the latch on the inside of the cupboard door. There was no latch on the inside. There had never been a latch on the inside. This was the point of the bolts on the outside. Harry put his hand flat against the wood of the door and stopped time. In the golden silence, the arrested moment, the non-color dark of between, he simply pushed. Not hard. He pushed with the particular quality of stopped time behind his hand, the sense that in this moment, with the world frozen around him, the normal rules of this bolt is locked were suggestions rather than laws. The wood resisted. He pushed with slightly more of himself. The bolts on the outside, moving against the motionless air of a stopped world, drew back. He felt them move, gently, mechanically, the way you feel a key turning in a lock that wants to open. He let time resume. The cupboard door swung open. Harry stepped out into the dark hallway and stretched, the full, unself-conscious stretch of someone who had been in a small space for too long, and then walked into the kitchen and made himself a cup of tea. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark and drank it and thought about what he wanted. This was a relatively new exercise. For most of his life, what Harry wanted had not been a productive avenue of inquiry because what Harry wanted was not a factor anyone in this house was considering. But he had gotten into the habit over the past year of running the question as a kind of practice, not hoping, exactly, but mapping. Knowing what he wanted was the prerequisite for knowing whether he was getting any closer to it. He wanted to understand what he was. He wanted to meet other people who knew about magic, not the dim awareness that something was different about him, but actual knowledge, actual other people, actual explanation. He wanted to be somewhere that wasn't this house. He wanted, and this was the one that surprised him sometimes with its intensity, he wanted to know if the man who had come to his cupboard when he was 4 had done the same thing to anyone else, and if not, why him. The letter arrived 3 days later. He was in the garden, weeding, because Vernon had discovered that giving Harry outdoor chores meant Petunia could look out at her roses without looking at Harry, which was more appealing to her than the alternative. The owl landed on the fence post beside him with a solemnity that suggested it had been briefed on the importance of its errand and taken the briefing seriously. It held out its leg with the letter attached. Harry took it. He read Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs in emerald green ink, and felt the specific satisfaction of being found, not by the Desley system, which had always known exactly where he was and considered it the right place for him, but by something else. Something that knew his name and knew his address and wrote it on an envelope with the kind of specificity that meant it wasn't an accident. He tucked the letter inside his shirt and went back to weeding, because Vernon was watching from the kitchen window and Harry had not survived 10 years in this house by showing his hand before he needed to. That evening, the house exploded. Not literally. But the letter had been addressed to Harry, and Vernon had opened it, had taken it from the post before Harry had a chance to see it arrive, and had read it, and the color his face turned was a new addition to the Desley palette. Something between puce and the purple of very old bruises. He stood in the kitchen holding the Hogwarts letter and looked at Harry across the table with an expression that contained, underneath all the fury, something Harry recognized as fear. "You knew," Vernon said. His voice was very controlled in the way of people controlling something large. "You knew about this." "About what?" Harry asked. He kept his voice mild. He was very good at mild. This letter. This school. Don't play stupid with me, boy. I knew something was different about me, Harry said. I didn't know the name of the school. You're not going, Vernon said. Whatever this is, whatever they're trying to pull, you are not going, and that's the end of it. Harry looked at him across the table. It had been a long time since Vernon's anger had produced in Harry anything stronger than a kind of mild interest. He watched it the way he watched rain, a natural phenomenon with predictable patterns that didn't require a personal response. But the letter in Vernon's hand said Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and it said it with the confidence of an institution that had been saying such things for 1,000 years, and Harry found that he was done. I am going, Harry said. Vernon blinked. This was not a sentence that had ever come out of Harry's mouth before, in this tone, with this delivery. The delivery was the thing, completely flat, completely unafraid, the tone of someone stating the temperature. What did you say? Vernon asked. I said I'm going. Harry reached across the table and took the letter from Vernon's hand. Vernon let him take it, which he would spend some time later that evening not understanding. I'll need money for supplies. I know there's an account my parents left. I've known about it for a while, actually. Gringotts Bank. He had read this in a book on wizarding financial structures he'd found in the restricted corner of a used bookstore in town when he was 9. The librarian there had been considerably less charmed by him than Mrs. Fleming. I'll get to London myself. You cannot. Vernon stood up, which was a physical intimidation tactic that had worked on Harry until approximately age 7. You are a child, you live in my house, you will do as I say, and if you think for 1 second, Harry stopped time. The kitchen froze. Vernon mid-sentence, his face a perfect still life of outrage and authority. Petunia reaching for her tea, cup halfway to her mouth. Dudley at the far end of the table, frozen in the act of stuffing a biscuit into an already full mouth. The clock on the wall stopped. Harry sat in the silence and read his Hogwarts letter in full, once, and then again, more slowly. He noted the list of required supplies. He noted the address of the Leaky Cauldron as the entry point to Diagon Alley. He noted that September 1st was the departure date. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and let time resume. That I won't, Vernon stopped. His sentence had lost its beginning and he stood there, slightly wrong-footed in a way he couldn't account for, the thread of his fury momentarily tangled. Thank you, Uncle Vernon, Harry said. I'll be out of your way by next week. He went to his cupboard and lay down and looked up at the underside of the staircase, which had been his ceiling for as long as he could remember. He could hear Vernon downstairs, still talking, still working himself up, the familiar sound of it overlapping with Petunia's thin anxious agreement. It was the sound of his whole childhood, slightly muffled by wood and plaster, and it produced in him now only a distant quality of completion, not relief exactly, but the specific feeling of a chapter ending. He thought about the man in the coat. About cold hands and the knot color of between and a boy's drawing of a green blob and a yellow sun taped to the wall of a cupboard. About the way the man had looked at him, not with pity, not with the irritated tolerance of adults who noticed him and then wished they hadn't. With something else. Something that Harry had no complete word for yet but which he had felt like a tuning fork being struck, recognition. He had grown up in a cupboard. He had grown up invisible and small and tolerated at best and targeted at worst, and somewhere in the machinery of that upbringing something had taken root that was not smallness and was not invisibility and was not, in any conceivable sense, afraid. He folded his hands on his chest and looked at the ceiling and stopped time for the simple pleasure of it, the silence, the golden quality of the dark, the feeling of being the only moving thing in a world that had agreed, just for a moment, to hold still. He held it for 4 minutes. Then 5. He wasn't counting anymore. Outside, through the frozen window, a moth hung mid-flight between a street lamp and the darkness, suspended in the amber cone of light, wings spread in the absolute perfection of stopped motion. Harry looked at it and smiled. It was a small smile, private, not performed for anyone. The smile of someone who knows something the world hasn't found out yet. He let time go. The moth resumed its wobbling orbit around the lamp. The clock downstairs ticked. Vernon's voice rose and fell and eventually went to bed. Harry Potter closed his eyes and waited for morning, and the world, which had always been moving without his permission, moved on, and for the first time in his life, he felt entirely, precisely at home in his own stillness. He had 1 week left in this house. Then Diagon Alley. Then Hogwarts. Then everything else. He was ready. He had been ready, he thought, since he was 4 years old in a cupboard, looking up at a man who looked back at him and saw something worth changing. Harry pulled his blanket up, tucked the letter beneath it, pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat, and slept. He dreamed of stop time, which is to say he dreamed of silence, which is to say he dreamed of himself, of a boy standing in the absolute still center of a frozen world, and the world very beautiful around him, and the boy at peace in it, and the boy not afraid of anything. Not of the Dursleys. Not of the thing Voldemort had done to his parents, the echo of which he carried in his scar without fully understanding it yet. Not of Hogwarts, which was enormous and unknown and full of other people's expectations. Not of anything. He was Harry Potter. He was the god of frozen time. He was 10 years old and he had never been given anything except a cupboard and 2 bolts on the outside of the door and a single gift from a man who had looked at him and recognized something. He had taken all of it and made himself anyway. In the morning, he cooked breakfast for the last time, and he set Vernon's plate down in front of him and looked at the man, really looked at him, with the full attention of someone who notices things, and Vernon looked away first. He always would have, if Harry had looked at him like that. He just hadn't known it until now. Chapter 2, The World Bends. The leaky cauldron smelled like wood smoke and something older than wood, some bass note of the place that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth or the drinks on the tables and everything to do with what it was, a threshold. A place between things. Harry stood just inside the door and let his eyes move around the room and felt, with quiet certainty, that he had been heading here his entire life. He had gotten to London by bus. 2 buses, actually, the first from Little Whinging to the station, the second into the city, paid for with coins he'd been saving in a cracked mug at the back of his cupboard shelf for 2 years, a little at a time, from pocket change he found on the Dursleys' kitchen counter and the occasional pound Dudley dropped without noticing. Harry had never considered this theft. He considered it interest on a debt that was never going to be repaid any other way. He had his Hogwarts letter in his jacket pocket and a list of everything he needed and the complete absence of an adult telling him what to do, and he was, by any measure, the calmest person in the leaky cauldron. The barman, Tom, old and small and walnut-faced, came around the bar with his hands already moving in a gesture of welcome and stopped when he saw Harry. Stopped and looked. His mouth opened and then closed, and his eyes went briefly, involuntarily, to the lightning scar visible at Harry's hairline. "Bless my soul," Tom said softly. "Harry Potter." Harry looked at him with friendly patience. "I need to get into Diagon Alley." Tom blinked. He had clearly been preparing a different kind of moment, something ceremonial, some version of welcome that involved more reverence and more talking. Harry's tone didn't leave room for it, which was not rude but was extremely clear. Tom recovered with the efficiency of a man who had run this particular establishment for decades and could adapt. "Course," he said. "Right this way, Mr. Potter." "Right this way." He led Harry through the pub and out the back door into a small yard and pulled out a wand and tapped the bricks in a sequence. Harry watched the sequence. He watched it the way he watched everything, completely, with the particular quality of attention that meant he was storing it rather than just seeing it. The wall unfolded. The archway grew. The noise of Diagon Alley, which had been a dim improbable sense from the other side, hit him full in the face. He stepped through. The first thing he thought was of course. The alley stretched ahead of him crowded and colorful and improbable, and it felt like walking into the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. Owls in cages. Cauldrons stacked in pyramids outside a brass-fronted shop. A boy his own age pointing at a broom in a window. Witches in robes, wizards in hats, everything bright and loud and smelling of parchment and potion ingredients and the faint sulfur tang of something experimental coming from a shop 3 doors down. He didn't stop to stare. He walked forward, reading the signs, orienting himself, and found Gringotts at the far end of the alley like a white marble exclamation point. The goblins made other visitors nervous. Harry could see this in the way people stood at the counters, shoulders elevated, voices dropping to a register of managed unease, the body language of people trying to seem more significant than they felt. Harry approached the nearest available teller with the same energy he brought to everything, which was to say directly, without performance. "Harry Potter," he said. "I need to access my account." The goblin looked down at him. Goblins had the particular quality of finding most things beneath them, and this one, Griphook, his nameplate said, managed to combine mild interest with deep disinterest in a way that Harry found almost admirable. "Do you have your key?" "No," Harry said. "I didn't know I had an account until 3 days ago." "There must be another way." Griphook studied him. He looked at the scar. He looked at Harry's eyes and then, Harry noticed this, it was small but it was there, the goblin's gaze dropped slightly, fractionally, to Harry's hands, and something in his expression shifted. The look of a professional encountering something professionally interesting. "Blood verification," Griphook said crisply. "Standard procedure for lost keys. Follow me." The vault was deep underground, reached by the cart system on rails that took corners at angles that suggested the tracks had been laid by someone with a personal grudge against gradual deceleration. Harry held the side of the cart without holding on for dear life, the distinction was important and he was aware of it as he made it, and watched the vault numbers descend and the passages change from finished stone to raw rock face. Griphook kept glancing at him from the corner of one yellow eye with the expression of someone revising an estimate. The Potter vault was not the largest he'd seen signposted on the way down. But it was substantial. Harry stood in the entrance and looked at the stacked gold with the calm of someone who had been poor for so long that large wealth registered not as excitement but as a practical change in a practical situation. He filled a bag methodically. What he needed for school. A reserve. He didn't take more than that because he had not come here to be rich. He had come here because he needed materials and materials required payment. "Who manages this account?" he asked Griphook on the way back up. "A representative of the Dumbledore family trust in technical terms, but in practice it has been largely dormant since your parents' deaths," Griphook said, with the clipped neutrality of a professional discussing facts. "You were listed as sole heir at birth. Now that you've accessed it, it reverts fully to your direct management." "Good," Harry said. Griphook looked at him sideways in the cart. "You're very calm for someone who's just found out they have significant independent wealth." "I've been making decisions by myself for a long time," Harry said. "Having the money to fund them is helpful." "It's not surprising." Griphook's mouth did something that may or may not have been the beginning of a smile. He didn't offer more and Harry didn't push, and they arrived back at the surface and went their separate ways with the mutual respect of people who have efficiently completed a transaction. Diagon Alley took him most of the morning. He bought his robes first, at Madame Malkin's, where another boy was already being fitted when he arrived, pale, blonde, with the manner of someone who had grown up understanding that attention was his natural due. He introduced himself as Draco Malfoy before Harry had a chance to do anything, and he talked with the fluid confidence of someone who had never been in a room where he wasn't comfortable. "Hogwarts?" Draco said. "First year." "Me too." "Do you know what house you want to be in?" "I don't know enough about the houses yet," Harry said. "Slytherin," Draco said immediately, with the tone of someone stating an inevitability. "All our family's been Slytherin. Dad says it's the only house worth being in, really. Gryffindors are reckless. Hufflepuffs are," he waved a hand, "you know. And Ravenclaws are all right if you don't mind spending 7 years with people who'd rather read than do anything." He looked at Harry properly for the first time. Saw the scar. His expression recalibrated in real time. "Blimey, are you Harry Potter?" "Yes," Harry said. Draco processed this with visible effort. You'll probably be Gryffindor, then, he said, recovering quickly. The famous ones usually are. Though if you were smart, he stopped himself, seeming to realize mid-sentence that he was on uncertain ground. Harry let him stop. He wasn't offended and he wasn't impressed and he didn't need to perform either. He was measured and fitted and he paid for his robes and went to get his books, and Draco Malfoy watched him leave with the expression of someone who had expected a different kind of encounter. The bookshop was enormous and wonderful and Harry allowed himself 20 extra minutes in it because it was books and he had been in love with books since Mrs. Fleming first showed him where they kept the mythology section. He bought his school books plus 4 others that had nothing to do with the curriculum: A History of Magical Britain, A Theory of Advanced Transfiguration, a text on time-related magical phenomena that he'd seen on the shelf and pulled out with the careful restraint of someone not wanting to seem too interested and then carried to the counter immediately, and an old, battered volume titled Exceptional Magical Lineages and Anomalous Births that looked like it hadn't been touched in years and had, tucked into its index, a single reference to temporal magical resonance that Harry intended to read very carefully in private. He bought his potion ingredients and his cauldron, and at some point in the middle of the alley he stopped and had a meat pie from a small food cart, eating it standing up, watching the crowd move around him. He had always been good at watching. He tracked the way people deferred to other people, the small social physics of who stepped aside and who didn't, who made eye contact and who looked at their shoes, whose presence changed the pressure in the space around them. It was information he found useful and freely available to anyone willing to look. He found himself, eventually, at Ollivander's. The shop was narrow and dim and smelled of sawdust and something resinous and very old. The wand maker appeared from the back the way wand makers apparently always did, from shadows and silence, with the predatory patience of someone who had been waiting specifically for you, which in Ollivander's case was possibly not an affectation. Harry Potter, Ollivander said, and his pale eyes caught the light and held it. He was the kind of old that had moved beyond age into something else, permanence, perhaps. I was wondering when you'd come in. Were you? Harry said, setting his bags down. Ollivander was already moving, sliding ladders on rails, pulling boxes, with the fluid purposefulness of someone conducting a process they had performed thousands of times and never once found tedious. Your father, now, James Potter, Holly, 11 inches, pliable, mahogany. Superb for transfiguration. And your mother, Lily, 10 1/4, willow, swishy. Lovely wand, that was. Most unusual. He stopped himself and looked at Harry with those moon-like eyes. You're not listening to the preamble. I'm listening, Harry said. I'm just also watching what you're pulling from which sections. Ollivander paused. He was holding a box and he set it down very carefully. Most children are nervous at this point. I know, Harry said. Try the wand. It was an interesting half-hour. Ollivander went through them with the focused patience of someone who was genuinely curious about the result: maple and phoenix feather, no; ebony and dragon heartstring, a few sparks but clearly wrong; something in chestnut that produced a burst of warm air but nothing more. Harry let him work, trying each in turn, and with each failed wand he felt Ollivander's interest sharpen incrementally, a subtle recalibration behind those pale eyes. When Ollivander produced the 11th wand, he paused before offering it. He looked at it and then at Harry with an expression that was as close to uncertainty as Harry suspected the man ever got. Holly, Ollivander said. 11 inches. Phoenix feather. He held it a moment longer. The core is unusual. The feather came from a very specific phoenix, and I've only ever used 2 feathers from this particular bird. He offered it. The other wand it produced is connected to you, in a sense. Your scar suggests as much. Harry took the wand. It was immediate and it was warm and it was nothing like the pressure of stop time, but it rhymed with it, the same quality of potential in a container, the same sense of something that had been waiting to be used correctly. The air in the shop moved. Not dramatically. Not with sparks or noise. Just a quiet shift, like the room taking a breath, and the dust on the countertop rose and hung suspended for one beat before settling, and Ollivander watched this with an expression that had passed through surprise and arrived somewhere quieter. "Curious," he said softly. "What?" Harry asked. "The wand chose you, obviously, and it chose you correctly, that's clear enough. But the effect," he looked at the dust, which had settled. "Most wands produce motion when they choose. Sparks. Wind. Something expansive. Yours," he frowned thoughtfully. "Yours produced stillness." "Yes," Harry said. He reached into his bag for his coin purse. "Mr. Potter," Ollivander said, and his voice had changed, not afraid exactly, but with the quality of someone speaking carefully. "May I ask, have you had any unusual experiences with time? Any sensation of, how much do I owe you?" Harry asked. "A beat." Ollivander was not a man who was often redirected. He took the redirection with good grace, named his price, took his payment, and watched Harry gather his bags and his wand in its box and head for the door. "Mr. Potter," he said once more, just at the threshold. Harry stopped. Turned. "Be careful," Ollivander said, "with the thing you are." Harry looked at him for a moment. The old man's face was completely open, not warning, not threat. Just the simple concern of someone who had touched the edge of something enormous and wanted it acknowledged. "I'm always careful," Harry said. "I'm just not afraid." He went back out into the alley, picked up his owl, a snowy white bird at the Ollery who walked up to his arm before he'd pointed at any of them, with the decisive authority of someone who'd already made the choice, and spent 20 minutes thinking of a name while the owl watched him with enormous amber eyes. "Frost," he said finally. The owl ruffled her feathers with approval and Harry carried her out of Diagon Alley, back through the leaky cauldron, back into the normal London afternoon, and took the bus home with 7 weeks to wait and no particular anxiety about any of it. The 1st of September arrived the way important days do, unremarkably, indifferently, with the same grey morning light as any other day and no acknowledgement from the universe that anything had changed. Harry was standing on platform 9 3/4 at 10:15 in the morning, early enough that the train was still being loaded, and he had gotten there by himself because the Dursleys had been in the car, which had been his plan all along. He had told Vernon, the evening before, in a tone that allowed no room for negotiation, that he required transport to King's Cross at 9 in the morning. Vernon had said nothing in the particular way of someone who had decided that the least interaction possible was the safest strategy. They had driven in silence. Harry had looked out the window at the city and thought about the year ahead. He had run the wall between platforms 9 and 10 at a jog, having tested the theory with his hand first and found the barrier give like a membrane rather than stone, and he'd stepped through onto the platform and into the noise and the steam and the red engine and felt again that quality of course, that low-frequency rightness that told him he was in the correct place. He found a compartment toward the middle of the train and put his trunk overhead and settled Frost's cage on the seat beside him, and he opened exceptional magical lineages and anomalous births to the page he'd marked and was 2 paragraphs into it when the compartment door slid open and a girl looked in. She was brown-skinned, slightly out of breath, carrying a very large book under one arm as a natural appendage, and she looked around the compartment with the rapid efficiency of someone cataloging available options. She saw the one other occupied seat, saw Harry's book, saw Frost, and looked at Harry directly. "Is anyone sitting there?" she asked, pointing to the seat across from him. "No," Harry said. She sat down and opened her book. Her book, Harry noticed, was Hogwarts, a history. She had tabbed a section with a folded corner and she picked up reading where she'd left off without another word, and Harry found he liked her immediately on the basis of this. The ability to be in a space with another person and not feel obligated to fill it with noise was, in his experience, rarer than it should be. They read in companionable silence for almost 20 minutes before she looked up. "That's an unusual owl," she said, looking at Frost. "Most people have tawny owls or barn owls." "She chose herself," Harry said. "Owls don't technically choose." There, she stopped. Looked at the owl. Frost was regarding her with the serene, slightly supercilious calm of someone who absolutely does choose and knows it. She looks like she's listening. She usually is, Harry said. The girl looked at him. She had the focused attention of someone who processed things quickly and liked to be correct, and her expression had the slight crease of someone updating a first impression. I'm Hermione, she said. Hermione Granger. I'm Muggle-born, both my parents are dentists. I read everything I could find about Hogwarts before I came, and I've already memorized the core curriculum for first year because I believe preparation is. She stopped herself. Sorry. I do that. Just say all of it at once. That's fine, Harry said. I'm Harry. She looked at his forehead. The scar, which he'd made no effort to hide. Her eyes went wide, not with the trembling reverence Tom the barman had shown, but with the specific look of someone having information confirmed. Harry Potter, she said. I read about you, too. Quite a lot, actually. The books don't agree on very much. Some of them say you should be very powerful because of how you survived, and some of them say the power was reflected back and you might be quite ordinary, magically speaking. She paused. I didn't mean that rudely. It's not rude, Harry said. It's accurate. Hermione opened her mouth and then closed it. The books are wrong, she guessed. The books are working with limited information, Harry said. Drink? The trolley had just appeared outside the compartment window and he'd already stood up before she answered. He bought enough for both of them without asking what she wanted, an assortment, the same approach to information gaps he applied to everything, and they spread it on the seats between them and ate and talked, and Harry found that talked was the right word in a way that it rarely was for him, because Hermione Granger's mind moved at a speed that required him to engage rather than manage. She had the wonderful quality of someone who was intelligent enough to be wrong in interesting ways, who would propose a theory with total confidence and then 3 sentences later, mid-thought, catch her own error and correct it without embarrassment. She asked good questions. She didn't stop asking them when the answers weren't what she'd expected. She didn't look at his scar the way most people did, like a symbol, like a proof, like a story that had already been told. She looked at him. By the time the train pulled into Hogsmeade Station, they had covered curriculum theory, the ethics of Muggle-baiting laws, the taxonomy of known magical creatures, and 3 separate tangents that had started with one subject and ended in a completely different one. She had also, without quite meaning to, told him about missing her parents already, in a single sentence that she immediately moved past but that Harry registered and filed. You're nothing like what the books describe, Hermione said, pulling on her robes on the platform. Good, Harry said. I didn't say whether that was good or bad yet. I know, Harry said. She looked at him for a beat. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Good, she agreed. Hogwarts at night, approached by boat across the Black Lake, was the kind of thing that made even very composed 10-year-olds briefly lose their composure. Harry let himself look at it. He allowed himself that, the full, unguarded look that the castle deserved, the towers and the lit windows and the reflection in the water, the sense of mass and age and accumulated presence. He looked at it for the duration of the crossing, and then he looked at the other first years in the boats, their faces ranging from terrified to ecstatic to the careful blankness of children trying very hard to seem unbothered, and he felt something that was adjacent to affection, for all of them, these strangers, these people who would be his year, his cohort, the backdrop of whatever this place was going to produce in him. A red-headed boy in his boat was gripping the side with both hands and staring at the lake's surface with the focused energy of someone not thinking about what was underneath it. A round-faced boy in the next boat had his eyes entirely on the castle with an expression of pure, helpless wonder that had no self-consciousness in it at all. Harry noted them both. The sorting was what it was. The hat was put on heads and it sorted and the names were called and children walked to tables amid applause and sat down and looked relieved or occasionally devastated. Harry watched from the middle of the line, reading the room, the tables, the professors at the head of the hall, the teacher with the purple turban who had a quality of wrongness Harry filed immediately as attention required, and the silver-bearded professor at the center of the high table who watched the sorting with the calm ownership of a man who had built the place and knew it. Dumbledore looked at every student when they were sorted. When Harry reached the front of the line, Dumbledore looked at him and his expression was briefly something other than the serene authority it had been for everyone else. Something moved behind those half-moon glasses. Calculation that it was not quite quick enough to fully conceal. Harry noted that too. Potter, Harry. He sat on the stool. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and he found himself sitting in the sudden interior dark of very old, thinking fabric, and a voice that was not a voice said inside his mind, exceptional. I haven't felt anything like this in, well, not in a very long time. What am I? Harry thought, because if anything had a database of relevant information, a hat that had sorted every witch and wizard through 1,000 years of British magical education was probably near the top. You are a wizard, the hat said carefully. And something else, additionally. Something the sorting categories don't quite have a column for. A pause that felt contemplative. But you have a mind. And your mind is extraordinary, curious, disciplined, brave in the way that requires no audience, and with a capacity for strategy that I usually only encounter after several more years of living. Another pause. You do very well in Slytherin. Or Ravenclaw. But there's something at the root of you that is, elemental. Brave in the truest sense, which is not fearlessness, it's, just decide, Harry thought, without heat, simply as a practical suggestion. The hat made a sound that was definitely a laugh. Gryffindor. The table on the left erupted. Harry put the hat back into McGonagall's hands and walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down, and people immediately started talking at him, a set of twins with matching grins, an older student with a prefect badge, someone further down offering handshakes, and Harry was gracious and present and answered what was answered and didn't answer what wasn't. And across the hall he saw Hermione sit under the hat for a much longer time and then walk to Gryffindor, and she sat beside him and they exchanged a single look that communicated mutual relief without needing to be translated. The red-headed boy from the boat, Ron Weasley, now, he had a name, sat across from Harry and proceeded to be enthusiastically in awe for approximately 3 minutes before Hermione said something about wand safety that Ron disputed on principle and they were off, which was, Harry thought, probably going to be a permanent state of affairs between them. The feast appeared on the tables. The hall filled with the noise of 150 children who'd been on a train all day and hadn't eaten since the trolley. The candles in their hundreds floated above the tables, and Harry was eating and listening to Ron describe the entire Weasley family tree in more detail than was strictly necessary, and he was fine, and the night was good, and he wasn't paying particular attention to the candles. But there was one. Third table back on the left, a cluster of candles in a golden branch holder, and one of them was at the end of its taper, the wax almost gone, the flames sitting on the last quarter-inch with the particular urgency of imminent extinction, leaning slightly in the draught from the high windows, and Harry without quite meaning to, without deciding to, simply felt it and stopped. Time stopped. The entire great hall went still. Every candle froze mid-flicker. The professors at the high table arrested mid-sentence, mid-gesture. The sorting hat, draped over the stool, stopped its faint swaying. 472 people suspended in a single instant of golden candlelight, motionless, caught between one breath and the next. The only movement in the entire hall was the ghost of a draft, which couldn't be stopped because it wasn't quite a thing, and Harry, who lifted his hand and looked at his palm, and the wax drip on the candle at the end of the third table back that hung mid-fall, a teardrop of white wax suspended impossibly in the warm air. 3 seconds. He let time go. The wax drip hit the tablecloth. The candle guttered and went out. The hall continued its 472 conversations without pause, without awareness, without the slightest indication that the world had just taken a 3-second breath. Except for Hermione. She was sitting beside him with a fork halfway to her mouth and she had gone very still in a different way, the stillness of someone who had just noticed something. Her fork descended slowly back to her plate. She looked at Harry with the expression of her mind going very fast behind her eyes. "Did you just," she started. "Yes," Harry said. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "How long have you been able to do that?" "Since I was 4, Harry said. Hermione looked at the extinguished candle at the third table back. She looked at Harry. She turned this over in her mind with the visible thoroughness of someone who was going to have a lot of questions, and then she made the decision that Harry would come to recognize as one of her defining qualities. She picked up her fork and went back to eating, because this was clearly an ongoing situation and a feast was not the venue and there would be time later for all of it. "All right," she said. Across the room, from the high table, Dumbledore's eyes tracked slowly to Harry and rested there. His expression was perfectly pleasant. His eyes were not. They were the eyes of someone who has just watched something and is revising, rapidly, an assumption he'd been relying on for years. Harry did not look at him. He was listening to Ron explain Quidditch, which apparently required the same energy level as a sporting event itself, and he was eating roast chicken, and Frost was in the Ollery, and tomorrow his first classes started, and the castle was large and old and full of things to learn. He was, Harry Potter, 11 years old and already a category the hat didn't have a column for, and he was entirely, precisely at home. Behind him, every candle in the great hall burned without wavering, because something in the air around Harry Potter was still resonating with the frequency of stop time, and fire knows, instinctively, when it is in the presence of something it shouldn't argue with. Chapter 3, The Stone Beneath Frozen Hands. The defense against the dark arts classroom smelled wrong. Harry noticed it on the first day, a low, layered smell that didn't match the room, like something biological wrapped in layers of something chemical, and underneath both of those something older and harder to name. He sat in the third row and noted it and said nothing, because noting things and saying nothing was a strategy that had served him extremely well for 10 years and he saw no reason to retire it. Professor Quirrell taught from behind a stutter that Harry clocked as performance within the first 4 minutes. It was too consistent. A real stutter has texture, it worsens under specific pressures, smooths in moments of genuine ease, anchors itself to particular sounds or situations. Quirrell's was perfectly distributed, arriving at regular enough intervals to seem authentic to anyone who wasn't paying the particular kind of attention Harry paid. It arrived on easy words and skipped over complicated ones. It was, in the technical sense, a very good piece of theater. Harry sat through the lesson and took notes and asked 2 questions, one that was genuine, about the limitations of shield charms against non-corporeal attackers, and one designed to produce a specific response, asking Quirrell to elaborate on the dark creatures he'd supposedly encountered in his travels. Quirrell's stutter faltered for a fraction of a second. Then he leaned into it harder than usual. Harry wrote down, scared of something inside himself, not outside. Underlined it. Moved on. The quality of wrongness in the room had a directionality to it. It came, specifically, from the back of Quirrell's turban, which was a piece of information Harry filed alongside everything else without deciding yet what it meant. Hermione had noticed the smell too. She mentioned it after class, quietly, as they walked to Transfiguration, with the tone of someone who wasn't sure if they were imagining it. Harry confirmed she wasn't. She looked satisfied and troubled in equal measure, the expression she made when being right about something unpleasant. Neville Longbottom, walking with them because he'd fallen into step 2 corridors back and nobody had asked him to leave and he'd seemed to understand that as an invitation, said he'd thought it was him because he'd spilled a stinking solution on his robes last period. "It's not you," Hermione told him. "Oh, thank God," Neville said, with such genuine relief that Harry almost smiled. Neville had attached himself to Harry's orbit in the way of people who recognize safety without being able to articulate why. It wasn't that Harry protected him, Harry didn't protect anyone in the parental, hovering sense of the word. He was simply someone around whom the normal ecosystem of cruelty didn't function, and Neville, who had spent most of his pre-Hogwarts life being either patronized or ignored, found the atmosphere around Harry refreshingly neutral. He could breathe there. He was working out, slowly, that he was more capable than anyone had let him believe, and he was doing it in the company of people who had never suggested otherwise. Transfiguration was McGonagall, who was exactly what she looked like, a person of complete professional precision with very high standards and the patience to enforce them. She turned her desk into a pig and back in the first 30 seconds to establish what the class was working toward, and the class duly experienced the appropriate awe, and then she set them to transfiguring matches into needles and circled the room with the energy of someone who had done this specific exercise 412 times and had not yet lost the ability to be annoyed when it was done wrong. Harry's match became a needle on his second attempt. Perfect, slender, bright, sharp point, the eye cleanly punched. McGonagall examined it and then examined Harry with the same quality of attention, and then she moved on without comment. The no comment was, he understood, the highest praise available in this particular classroom. Hermione got hers on the third attempt, which was still exceptional, and she looked at Harry's with an expression that was a very contained version of competitive fury. He liked this about her enormously. "How did you do it so fast?" she asked after class. "The match already wants to be a needle," Harry said. "Both are thin, both are metal adjacent, both have a point. You're not forcing a transformation. You're showing it a direction." Hermione thought about this for several seconds. "That's not in the textbook." "I know," Harry said. She wrote it down anyway. This was also something he liked about her. She could be proprietary about knowledge and simultaneously absolutely ruthless about acquiring more of it, and the two impulses coexisted without contradiction. October arrived and with it Quidditch trials and a smell of wood smoke from the grounds and the first real indication of where the year was going. Harry had no particular reason to try out for Quidditch. He had no particular reason not to, either. He'd watched a match from the stands with Ron, who provided a commentary that was simultaneously more passionate and less organized than the official one, and found himself tracking the seekers rather than the ball, the way they moved in three-dimensional space, reading currents of air and competitor trajectory and the behavior of a small enchanted object that was essentially a very fast autonomous problem to be solved. He found the problem interesting. He tried out and made the team in 20 minutes, which was fast enough that Oliver would stood on the pitch afterward with the expression of someone who had been expecting a long process and wasn't sure what to do with the time he'd been given back. "You haven't played before?" Oliver said. "Never been on a broom before today," Harry said. Oliver stared at him. "You caught it behind your back. The angle was better." Oliver continued staring. Then the expression of a Quidditch captain overrode everything else and he started talking about practice schedules. The Nimbus 2000 arrived at breakfast by Owl the next morning, which was both kind of McGonagall and strategically inconvenient, because it confirmed to the entire Gryffindor table that Harry was on the team, which confirmed it to the entire hall, which by noon had confirmed it to the dungeons. Draco Malfoy found him between classes and said something unpleasant about Harry's broom and then something more unpleasant about first years generally and then something specifically aimed at Neville, who was standing nearby, that was designed to land on the softest available target. Harry turned and looked at Malfoy with the quality of attention that tended to stop people mid-sentence. Malfoy stopped mid-sentence. "That's enough," Harry said. "One sentence. No heat in it." The tone of someone who has evaluated a situation and issued a decision, not a request. Malfoy's two large companions, Crabbe and Goyle, who had the quality of furniture that could follow instructions, looked at Harry. Malfoy himself looked at Harry. Something passed through his expression, the start of a sneer, and then something underneath the sneer that was younger and less certain, and then the sneer won and he said something cutting and walked away, but he walked away, which was, Harry thought, the important thing. Neville said nothing. He had the look of someone recalibrating. Then he said, "Thanks," quietly, which Harry acknowledged with a nod, because the thank you was real and deserved a real response and anything more would have made it uncomfortable. Halloween arrived in its own particular way, the floating pumpkins and the bats that were probably more theatrical than functional and the feast that was, genuinely, the best food Harry had encountered in his 11 years on the planet. He was eating contentedly and listening to Ron argue with Hermione about the technique for the Wingardium Leviosa charm that they'd done in charms that morning, when he became aware that the argument was the kind that had escalated past the subject. It's Leviosa, not Leviosa, Hermione said, for the fourth time, with the particular emphasis of someone who has been correct from the beginning and is struggling with the social requirement not to say so too loudly. I know how to say it, Ron said. I just think there's more than one valid approach to the wrist movement. There isn't. Flitwick specifically said, Flitwick also has a voice like a very excited hinge and I couldn't always hear him. That's not my fault or the charm's fault, I'm just saying, you levitated the feather 4 inches and then it fell. I levitated mine to the ceiling, yes, Ron said, with the weight of someone who has been waiting to say this, we all saw. Hermione's face changed. Not hurt exactly, but something in the vicinity, the expression of someone who has been doing everything right and has been reminded that doing everything right is apparently also annoying. She stood up from the table with a dignity that was heartbreaking in exactly the way that 11-year-old dignity is always heartbreaking, and she walked out of the hall. Ron watched her go. He looked slightly sick. Harry ate a bread roll and said nothing. I didn't mean, Ron started. I know, Harry said. She's just so, I know. Ron pushed his plate around. Then Professor Quirrell burst through the doors of the Great Hall with a performance of panic that Harry observed with one eye, the stutter in full force, the arms, the carefully calibrated dramatic entrance. A troll, he announced. In the dungeons. Before fainting very theatrically. The hall erupted. Prefects. Directions. Houses being marshaled to dormitories. McGonagall sharp and efficient above the noise. Dumbledore taking the teachers to deal with the troll, and Harry watching all of it and running one arithmetic problem simultaneously. Hermione was in the girls' bathroom. The girls' bathroom and the dungeons were in opposite directions. The troll, if it had been directed by someone, and Harry thought about Quirrell's performed panic and the directionality of wrongness from his turban, was less likely to be in the dungeons and more likely to be wherever nobody was expecting it. He was out of his seat before the thought finished. He found the bathroom by the smell, which was troll specifically, a wet stone and garbage smell underpinned by something like animal confusion, and he pushed the door open and assessed the scene in approximately 1 second. Troll, enormous, the dull-eyed concrete aggression of something that hits things because that is what it does. Hermione backed against the sinks with her hands against the tile and her wand out but her face the face of someone who has read about this situation rather than been in it. The troll swung its club. Harry stopped time. The club froze mid-arc. The troll froze in its lumbering pivot. Hermione froze with her mouth half open on a word she never got to finish. The bathroom froze, the smell didn't, because smell isn't quite a thing, and the water still running from a cracked pipe along the far wall still ran, and Harry was the only thing moving in a room full of stopped stone and stopped monster and stopped girl. He walked past the troll's frozen elbow and stood in front of Hermione and looked at her face. She was frightened but she hadn't run. She'd been trying to think of a spell. Her wand was pointed at the troll with the fierce precision of someone who was going to get one shot and was going to make it count. He looked at this and filed it. Then he looked at the troll and considered his options, which were numerous. He chose the simplest one. He walked around behind the troll. It was large enough that the walking around part took a moment, and he stepped on the back of its knee with his full weight and used the frozen momentum of the swing to redirect the arm, and then he let time go. The troll lurched forward under its own momentum, redirected by the weight on its knee into the bank of sinks, and hit the porcelain with the force of a thing that weighed somewhere north of 1,000 pounds. The sinks exploded. The troll staggered and sat down hard and shook its enormous head, and by the time it had recovered any kind of directional sense, Ron had appeared in the doorway with his wand out saying something they'd learned in charms that morning, and the club levitated to the ceiling with the spell, and the troll looked up at its club with the single-minded confusion of the truly dim, and then the club dropped and knocked it unconscious. Silence. Ron still had his wand pointed at the ceiling. He looked at the unconscious troll. He looked at Hermione. He looked at Harry. Did we, you got the club, Harry said. McGonagall arrived with Snape and Quirrell in her wake and the three of them stopped in the doorway and looked at the troll on the floor and the demolished sinks and the 3 first years who were all fine. McGonagall's composure was extraordinary. "Explain," she said. Hermione explained. She and Ron had been going to get her, she said, which was not strictly the sequence of events but produced fewer questions, and Harry watched Quirrell while she talked. The professor was looking at the unconscious troll with an expression that was very carefully assembled into concerned relief, and it was very good, and Harry was certain it was entirely constructed. He looked at the back of the turban. The wrongness was there. Vivid in the broken fluorescent light of a bathroom with no sinks. Like a second pulse. Harry pointed his wand at his own head, the way he'd done at the feast when time had slipped, and then put it away because he didn't need it for this. He didn't need it for anything he did with Stop Time. The wand was for other things. McGonagall docked 5 points from Gryffindor because rules were rules and also gave Ron and Harry 5 each for correct magical response in a real emergency, which represented, in net terms, exactly 0 points, and she looked at Harry for a moment before she said anything about his arithmetic on the problem. "How did you know to come here?" she asked. "Logic," Harry said. She looked at him. The look of a woman who was processing subtext and deciding whether to pursue it. "Indeed," she said finally, which was the McGonagall version of "we'll talk about this later," and then she sent them back to the dormitory. The 3 of them walked up the stairs together. Ron was talking about the troll, the smell, the size, the fact that his Wingardium Leviosa had genuinely worked in a crisis, which had clearly recalibrated his feelings about the charm. Hermione walked and said nothing until they reached the junction for the girls' corridor. She turned to Harry. "You were there before the troll even reached me," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "You crossed the room faster than," she stopped. Reconsidered. "Time," she said. "Yes." She absorbed this. "You stopped it in the bathroom. For about 4 seconds. What did you do in 4 seconds? Figured out the best solution. Moved behind it. Redirected." Hermione stared at him. "You walked around a frozen troll and redirected it by stepping on its knee. It seemed efficient. A beat." Ron looked between them. "I'm missing something," he said. "He stopped time, Ron," Hermione said. Ron opened his mouth. He what?" "I'll explain in the morning," Harry said. "It's late." "You can't just say someone stopped time and then say it's late. Good night, Ron," Harry said, and went up the stairs, and behind him he could hear Ron's indignation and Hermione saying she'd explain properly and Ron saying explain it now then and Hermione saying I just said in the morning and the familiar rhythm of it following him up the corridor like a comfortable piece of background music. December was cold in a way that made sense, Hogwarts cold, not Surrey cold, with the grounds white and the lake iron grey and the castle somehow warmer for having all of it outside its windows. Harry spent the weeks before Christmas learning, which was what he did with available time when nobody was asking him to do anything else. He found the 3rd floor corridor by the end of November, because the prohibition on it was an obvious marker. Don't go. There was always a pointing finger for anyone who noticed pointing fingers. He went there once, after midnight, walking in stop time through the castle so that no ghost or portrait or caretaker would catch anything more than a brief anomaly in the air, and he opened the door and looked at the 3-headed dog in the trapdoor and made several notes in his head and left. He told Hermione. She cross-referenced everything she knew about the school with this new information and arrived at Nicholas Flamel through a process that took her approximately 2 weeks of intensive library research, which Harry had been prepared to simply ask Dumbledore about but let her run because watching Hermione Granger chase a research problem was genuinely impressive and she deserved to find it herself. The Philosopher's Stone, she said, breathless, in the library corner they had claimed as their de facto headquarters. Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of it. It produces the elixir of life. It must be what's being kept in the school, moved from Gringotts, Hagrid mentioned. Someone's trying to steal it, Harry said. Quirrell, Hermione said, because she had arrived at the same place Harry had arrived at in September, through a different route but with the same conclusion. Quirrell, Harry agreed. We should tell Dumbledore, Hermione said. Harry said nothing. She looked at him. You don't think we should tell Dumbledore? I think Dumbledore already knows, Harry said. I think he set this up. The stone is bait, the corridor is a challenge, and we're being watched to see who we are under pressure. Hermione processed this. That's quite a dark interpretation. It's the most logical one, Harry said. A man who's been alive for over 150 years, who runs this school, who has access to the most qualified witches and wizards in Britain, who knew the stone was a target, he put it in a school full of children behind a series of traps a first year can solve. Either he's underestimating the threat, or the whole thing is a test. Or both, Hermione said quietly. Or both, Harry agreed. She turned her quill in her fingers, which was what she did when she was thinking through implications. So what do we do? Wait, Harry said. Watch. When Quirrell moves, we'll know. And then I'll deal with it. Hermione said firmly. Harry looked at her. You and Ron will be with me until the traps. And then? And then I'll deal with it, Harry repeated, not unkindly. She didn't like it. He could see that clearly. She had the look of someone who wanted to argue and was deciding whether the argument was winnable. She was, he thought, smart enough to know it wasn't, not because he would override her, but because she knew, at some level, what he was, and she had been quietly constructing a theory about it since September that was getting more accurate every week. Fine, she said, with the particular economy of someone who is agreeing to a specific thing and not a broader principle. June arrived with its end-of-term weight and the examinations and the rising sense of something approaching. Harry felt it building in Quirrell. The man was unraveling at the edges of his performance, the stutter less consistent, the turban carried with a kind of desperation he hadn't had in September. Whatever was on the back of his head was driving toward something. The night it happened started with Neville. Sweet, steady Neville, who had been watching Harry for months and building toward something himself, cornered them in the common room and tried to stop them from going out after curfew. He stood in front of the portrait hole with the expression of someone who was genuinely frightened and was going to stand there anyway, and Harry stopped in front of him and looked at him properly. You know something's wrong, Harry said. I know you're going to get in trouble and you're the best thing that's happened to Gryffindor since, I don't know, probably since ever, and I don't want you to. Neville stopped himself. It's more important to stand up to your friends than your enemies, he said, which he had clearly rehearsed. I read that. Dumbledore said it once. Harry looked at him for a long moment. You're right, he said. That's true. But I know what I'm doing. How? Because I know what's down there, Harry said. And I know what's going to happen to it. Neville searched his face. And if you're wrong? Then I'm wrong, Harry said. But I haven't been wrong yet. Neville held the position for another second. Then he stepped aside, not because he was convinced but because he trusted Harry, which was different and in some ways more significant. Don't die, he said. I won't, Harry said, simply, and meant it in the most literal possible sense. The fluffy-headed dog was not a problem. Harry stopped time, moved through the gap in its attention, pulled the harp string once and stopped time and felt its vibration hum in the frozen air, and let time go as they dropped through the trapdoor. The devil's snare came up in vines and Hermione dispatched it with Lumos Solum before Harry needed to act, moving with the crisp efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this and was delighted to find preparation useful. I remembered, she said, and the delight in her voice was completely unaffected. I know you did, Harry said. The keys were a broom problem. Harry was on the broom for approximately 90 seconds before he had the right key, which was the silver one that flew like it had a damaged wing, moving wrong in the same way that all things that have been used move differently from things that are new. He caught it and brought it back and unlocked the door. The chess was where he sent Ron back. Ron stared at him. You can't, it's a chess problem, the whole point is, I know, Harry said. I'm not playing. You, what? Harry looked at the chess pieces and stopped time. The board locked. He walked through the frozen pieces and unlocked the door on the other side. The chess pieces, in stop time, looked like monuments, enormous and solemn and very beautiful in the still air, marble faces blank, captured mid-intent. He stood among them for a moment before letting time go. The board erupted. Every piece moved at once in the pattern of the clock that had elapsed while time was stopped, and none of them were playing the same game anymore, and the resulting chaos produced on the chessboard something that no chess teacher would recognize but that got the door open, and Ron stared at it with the expression of someone watching physics malfunction. "Go back," Harry told him. "Both of you." "Harry," Hermione started. "I need you to watch the way back," he said, and it was true, but it was also a reason and not the reason, and Hermione heard both of those things simultaneously and took Ron's arm. "Be careful," she said. "I'm always careful," he said. "I'm just not afraid." She held his gaze for a beat. "I know," she said. "That's not actually what worries me." He went through alone. The troll room needed nothing, the troll was already unconscious from something prior, and Harry noted this with interest and moved through. The potion room was Snape's logic problem, a line of bottles and a scroll, and Harry read the riddle in 40 seconds and identified the correct bottle and drank it and moved forward into the dark of the last room. The mirror of Eriste stood in the center of the chamber like a question. And Quirrell stood before it, his back to Harry, his hands clasped behind him, his turban wrapped with the care of someone maintaining a necessary fiction. The stutter was completely gone. "I wondered when you'd come," Quirrell said. He turned. His face was different without the performance, calmer, hollower, the face of a man who had been steadily eaten from the inside for a year. "The headmaster thought I hadn't noticed his arrangements." He looked at Harry and something moved in his expression. "You're not afraid of me?" "No," Harry said. "You should be." "What I carry, I know what you carry," Harry said. "It's been behind your turban all year. It smells wrong." Quirrell's mouth tightened. "Tom will be very interested to meet you." "I'd rather not wait," Harry said. "What do you need from the mirror?" Quirrell blinked. The calm in Harry's voice had clearly bypassed the response Quirrell had prepared. "The stone," he said after a pause. "Obviously. You won't get it from the mirror the way you're looking at it," Harry said. "You're looking at what you want. The mirror gives you the stone if you want to find it, not use it." Quirrell stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I thought about what the mirror actually does," Harry said. "May I?" He walked to the mirror and looked at it. His reflection looked back. It was him, the same face, the same scar, the same slight build. But his reflection smiled and reached into its pocket and held up the stone, a red jewel in the reflected light, and Harry felt the weight of it appear in his actual pocket. He reached in. Closed his fingers around it. "Real." He turned around with the stone in his hand. Quirrell's eyes widened. He lunged. Harry stopped time. The room went gold and silent. Quirrell's lunge froze in mid-step, 1 foot off the ground, his hands extended toward the stone, his face a mask of desperate momentum. Harry looked at him, this man who was two things at once and had been deteriorating into neither for a year, and felt something that wasn't quite pity but was in the same neighborhood. He stepped around Quirrell and stopped time and looked at the back of the turban. "I know you're in there," Harry said, to the room, to the frozen air, to whatever was listening from behind the cloth. Nothing answered. Time was stopped. Even the things that weren't quite things were stopped, in stop time. Harry unwound the turban. The face on the back of Quirrell's head was a ruin. It had once been a man's face and the ghost of that was still present in its structure, the architecture of a jaw, cheekbones, an eye socket, but it had been away from its body for a decade and it showed. It was gaunt and gray and would have been terrifying to anyone who hadn't grown up in a cupboard and been reconstructed by a vampire god at 4 years old. Harry examined it with calm interest. "Voldemort," he said. He let time go. The face's eyes opened. They were red, and even in the catastrophic state of the thing's existence they had the quality of intelligence, not just cunning, but the sharp, burning intelligence of something that had been thinking in the dark for 10 years and never stopped. Quirrell straightened. He was no longer lunging. The shift in control was visible, the body's shoulders changed, the posture changed, the quality of attention in the room changed. Something had stepped forward. "Harry Potter," the voice said, from the face that wasn't a face. It was a remarkable voice, a voice that had clearly once been beautiful in the way of things that were made to compel, and even now, reduced to this, it had weight and resonance. "I see you." "Yes," Harry said. "You have the stone." "I do." "Give it to me," the voice said, "and I will give you what you actually want." "I know what you want." "Everyone wants something. Power, knowledge, revenge. What did they do to you, child?" "Put it in a cupboard." "Oh yes, I know about the cupboard. I know everything that concerns my most valuable piece of." "Don't," Harry said. The voice stopped. "Don't tell me what I want," Harry said. "And don't try to tell me what I am. We've both been used. We both grew up somewhere people put us when they didn't want to deal with us. I read about you. Tom Riddle. Wool's orphanage. I know that story." He turned the stone in his fingers. "And we are nothing alike." "No." The red eyes were very bright now. "A boy no one wanted. Exceptional power. Everyone frightened of him. No one is frightened of me," Harry said. "They're cautious. That's different. You made them afraid because you needed them to be afraid. I don't need anything from them." A silence. In the silence, Quirrell's hands opened and closed involuntarily, the body responding to two different pilots. "What you carry in yourself," the voice said, and it had shifted, dropped the persuasion, moved into something more direct, which Harry respected more, the power over time. "Do you know where it comes from? Do you know who gave it to you?" "Yes," Harry said. I know what he was," Harry said. "I've known for years. It doesn't change what I am." "You could join me," Voldemort said. "Everything you are, everything you could be, I could give you." "You have nothing to give," Harry said, not unkindly. "You're a face on the back of another man's head. You have a fragment of soul in a diary and possibly other places, and you have been diminished to this for 10 years and you are trying to steal a stone to fix it." He looked at the red eyes levelly. "That's not power. That's a problem." Voldemort's eyes narrowed. Then, very quietly, "Remarkable. Touch the stone," Harry said, "and I'll stop time and remove your soul fragment from Quirrell so cleanly you won't have anywhere to go. I don't know if that kills you permanently. I suspect it doesn't. But we can find out." A beat. The red eyes looked at him with the specific quality of a very intelligent thing recalculating. "You'd let him die." "Quirrell is dying anyway," Harry said. "You've been in him for a year. The body is almost gone." He said it simply, with no pleasure in it. "I don't want him to die. I'd rather you left voluntarily." "And if I don't?" Harry said nothing. He just looked. The look was sufficient. Voldemort was silent for a long moment. The red eyes moved from the stone to Harry's face and back, running the calculation over and over. He was not afraid, Harry could see he wasn't afraid, and respected him for it. But he was, perhaps for the first time in his existence, stymied. He had no move that the boy in front of him couldn't simply step out of. "This is not over," Voldemort said finally, and the words were true and Harry knew they were true. "I know," Harry said. "I will come back. I will return fully. And when I do, I'll be here," Harry said. "I'll be here and I'll be the same thing I am now. So will you, I suspect." The red eyes held his for one more beat. Then the force of them withdrew from the surface of the moment, and Quirrell sagged, and what left Quirrell's body left in a rush, smoke and cold and the sensation of a window opening in December, and poured past Harry and through the wall and was gone. Quirrell collapsed. Harry stood over him and looked at the man's face, which was now only a man's face, and the man was barely there, the physical cost of a year as someone else's host written in every line of skin. He was breathing, barely. Harry reached into his pocket and set the stone on the floor beside him, because the stone was not his to keep. He went to the door and stopped in the frame. "I know you've been watching," he said, to the room, to the shadows, to the mirror which reflected nothing now, to whatever presence he had felt above all of this from the moment he arrived. Dumbledore's voice came from the dark at the far end of the chamber, gentle and grave. "You knew I was here." "The whole time," Harry said. "You want to collect me now, or should I go back to the dormitory?" A pause. "Harry, good night, Professor," Harry said, and walked out of the chamber with the calm of someone who has finished a task and is ready to sleep, leaving behind him the mirror, the crumpled body of Quirrell, the stone on the floor, and Albus Dumbledore standing in the dark with the expression of a man who has been playing chess for 150 years and has just found a piece that doesn't move the way pieces are supposed to move. He walked back through the traps. He rejoined Hermione and Ron at the chess room, where they were waiting with the contained tension of people who had been trying very hard not to think about what might be happening. Hermione looked at him. "Well? Done," Harry said. "Voldemort? Gone. For now. Are you hurt?" "No." Ron looked between them again. "I feel like I missed the important parts," he said. "You got the key room," Harry said, and the small kindness of it, the genuine acknowledgement, produced on Ron's face the complicated expression of someone unused to being included in the account, and who was deciding rapidly that he was glad to be here. They walked back up through the castle in the grey hour before dawn, and the portraits slept in their frames, and the suits of armor stood their silent posts, and Hogwarts was quiet around them with the settled quiet of a very old building that has seen everything and keeps its own counsel. Harry walked among them and said nothing, and the stone was behind him in the chamber and Voldemort was dispersed and Quirrell was dying and the year was almost over and Dumbledore was somewhere in the dark revising his estimates. It was enough. For now, it was enough. He watched the sun come up through the window at the top of the stairs, the light arriving across the grounds and catching the lake and spreading in the specific slow way of light that has a long way to travel, and he felt the stop-time feeling in his blood, the hum of it, content, undemanding, the sound of something that belonged there. He let it hum. Chapter 4, The Chamber and the Crown. The summer between first and second year was the summer Harry stopped going back to the cupboard. Not literally, the Dursleys had moved him to Dudley's second bedroom after the first year at Hogwarts, a concession that had less to do with generosity and more to do with the fact that Petunia had seen the look on Vernon's face after the kitchen table incident in June and decided, with the survival instinct of a woman who had been managing a difficult man for 20 years, that some accommodations were cheaper than the alternative. The second bedroom had a bed and a window and 4 walls that were his, which was more than he'd had before. He read through the summer. All his school books twice over, then the supplementary texts he'd bought in Diagon Alley, then anything Hedwig could carry from the wizarding bookshop in London that would accept an owl order. He wrote to Hermione, who wrote back in letters that were slightly longer than his and contained marginalia and underlined sections and small stars next to things she found particularly interesting, which was a mapping system he learned to read quickly. He wrote to Ron in shorter letters, because Ron wrote in shorter letters, which Harry found restful. He did not write to Dumbledore, who had sent a brief, warm note that managed to say very little while seeming to say a great deal, a skill Harry noted with professional appreciation and no corresponding intention to respond. Neville sent him a postcard from Devon with a picture of a plant on it and the message, "Got top marks in herbology. Hope your summer is good. N." The postcard was 5 lines long and Harry reread it twice, which surprised him. The summer gave him time to think about Voldemort. Not with fear. The idea of fearing Voldemort was about as productive as fearing weather, but with the analytical interest he brought to problems that were going to require solutions. He thought about the night in the chamber, about the red eyes and the ruined face and the voice that had been, even in its diminished state, extraordinary. He thought about Tom Riddle, who had grown up in an orphanage and been exceptional and decided, somewhere in the machinery of that the answer to the world's disinterest was conquest. He had thought about two roads diverging and had arrived, again, at the same conclusion: the thing that separated them was not power and not origin and not even intention. It was need. Voldemort needed the world to acknowledge him. Harry needed nothing from the world at all. The soul fragment in the diary troubled him. He had mentioned it to no one. He turned it over all summer like a stone in a pocket. The implication that Voldemort had not just survived but had prepared for survival, had distributed pieces of himself like a contingency plan. It was intelligent in a way that Harry found genuinely impressive and deeply inconvenient. He went back to Hogwarts in September with this problem unsolved and filed under active. Second year began with a car. Ron and his brother Fred had appeared outside Privet Drive at 2 in the morning in a flying Ford Anglia, because Harry's letters had stopped arriving and Ron had done the calculation that something was wrong and then had done the further calculation that the correct response was go get him. Harry had been awake and packed in under 4 minutes, which was the kind of response time that told you something about the quality of his relationship with Privet Drive. They flew to the burrow in the dark with the windows down and the countryside unrolling beneath them like a rumpled green quilt, and Harry sat in the back with the wind and the altitude and looked out at the dark and felt, for one of the few times in his life, the uncomplicated lightness of being moved through space by someone else's good idea. The burrow was chaos and warmth, and Molly Weasley at 6 in the morning with a wooden spoon and feelings that ran at approximately twice the speed and volume of the feelings in any other house Harry had encountered. Ron's mother scolded with the specific energy of someone who was furious because they had been frightened, and the fury was shaped entirely by love, and Harry ate the largest breakfast anyone had ever put in front of him and watched the Weasley family operate and thought that this was what a house felt like when the people in it had decided, collectively, that they were on the same side. He liked it. He was careful not to like it too much, which was a distinction he had been making since he was 6 years old and had learned what happened to things he liked too much in the Dursleys' house. Diagon Alley in August was where he met Draco Malfoy again, this time with his father, Lucius Malfoy, who was the kind of man who had arranged himself very carefully around the premise that he was important, and who looked at the Weasleys with a contempt so practiced it had become structural. Lucius looked at Arthur Weasley's worn robes and the children's second-hand books and then looked at his own cane with the satisfaction of a man taking an inventory of advantages. He looked at Harry last. Something shifted in his expression. The contempt readjusted into something more careful, not respect exactly, but the calculation of a man who had been briefed on a person and was now revising the briefing against the reality. His eyes went to the scar and then to Harry's eyes and then, briefly and involuntarily, to Harry's hands. Harry watched him do it. He watched the way Lucius Malfoy arranged himself and the way Draco orbited him and the way Draco's face in his father's presence had a performed quality to it that it didn't have elsewhere, and he filed all of it. Harry Potter, Lucius said, with the graciousness of someone who had decided the best posture was graciousness. Draco's told me about you. Has he? Harry said. A remarkably composed young man, he said. Lucius smiled. Draco is not easily impressed. I know, Harry said. Lucius's smile held. His eyes did not entirely participate in it. Your parents were quite remarkable as well. In their different ways. The pause before different carried approximately 4 separate implications and Harry heard all of them. Yes, Harry said, and said nothing else, because Lucius Malfoy was the kind of man who expected a response and used the shape of the response to take measurements, and Harry had no interest in being measured. It was Lucius who looked away first. Harry and Ginny Weasley both reached for the same second-hand copy of a guide to advanced transfiguration and Harry stepped back to let her take it, and Lucius materialized beside Ginny and picked up her old textbooks with a sigh of theatrical distaste and dropped one of his own into her cauldron, a gesture of contemptuous charity designed to humiliate Arthur rather than help Ginny, the gift as weapon. Harry watched the book fall into the cauldron. He watched the specific weight of it land. He watched Ginny's face, which was 12 years old and didn't fully conceal what it felt. He made a note about the book. Hogwarts was different in September. The castle felt wrong in a way that was distinct from last year's wrong, less directed, more ambient, a low-frequency unease distributed through the stones. Harry felt it the way he felt stop time, in the back of his chest, below the level of deliberate attention, there and persistent. The first attack happened in October. Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, found petrified by a message written on the wall in what appeared to be blood and was almost certainly not. Harry stood in the small crowd that gathered and read the message and felt something crystallize: the chamber of secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. And understood three things simultaneously. Someone had opened a passage in the school that was very old and very dangerous. The passage was connected to Salazar Slytherin, who had views on blood purity that placed most of the people Harry knew in the enemy column, and the castle's wrongness was going to get worse before it got better. He also heard the voice. In the wall, in the stone, moving with a directionality that nothing else in the crowd could track, a sound like silk drawn over gravel, cold and deliberate and enormous, and Harry turned his head and followed it with his hearing until it faded in the direction of the dungeons and was gone. He knew what it was. He had read enough by then. He kept this information close and quiet. The attacks continued. Justin Finch Fletchley. Colin Creevey. A ghost. Each time the castle got slightly colder, slightly more afraid, and the fear had the quality of spreading downward, from students to teachers, settling in the spaces between conversations. Harry moved through it unchanged. He was not cold to the fear. He understood why it was there. He simply didn't share it, the way you don't share an illness you've been vaccinated against. Hermione had the same lead he did, arrived via library rather than instinct. A basilisk, she said, with the satisfaction of a diagnosis, holding up a page of most patenty potions where she'd found the reference. A basilisk. A snake that kills with its gaze. All the victims have only been partially petrified because none of them looked directly into its eyes, water, or reflection. The camera, it's moving through the pipes, Harry said. I can hear it. Hermione stared. You can hear it? I can hear it speaking, he said. I don't fully understand why. It's Parseltongue. I think I inherited it, somehow, from the Knight Voldemort. He paused. From the scar. Hermione was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Can you speak it back? Harry opened his mouth and said something that came from the back of his throat and arrived in the air as something that was not quite English and also not quite a sound, and Hermione's eyes went very wide. Don't do that again without warning me, she said. Sorry, Harry said. What did you say? Where are you going? Harry said. More or less. She wrote this down. Of course she wrote it down. The answer to the chamber's location was a bathroom. Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, haunted by the ghost of a girl who'd been killed there 50 years ago by looking at something she shouldn't have seen, and Harry sat on the edge of a sink and listened to Myrtle tell her story and tracked the details with the particular care he gave to things that had been waiting a long time to be relevant. Under the sink. A tap with a small snake engraved on it. A passage going down. He told Ron and Hermione and they both had the same response, which was the response of people who have been through a possessed professor and a mountain troll and a protection gauntlet in their first year, which is to say they accepted the situation and moved forward. You're going alone, Hermione said. It was not a question. I'm going to look first, Harry said. That's not the same as alone. It will be fine, he said. You keep saying that, Hermione said, and you keep being right, and I want you to know that does not make me feel better, it makes me feel worse. Harry thought about this. That's fair, he conceded. He went that night, in stop time, moving through the frozen castle like a thought moving through a sleeping brain. He found the tap and hissed at it and the sink swung aside and he looked down into the dark of the pipe and felt the cold air coming up and knew it was deep and old and had been waiting. He jumped. The pipe was long and fast and delivered him onto a wet stone floor in the dark with the practiced gentleness of a feature that had been designed to receive passengers rather than simply discard them. He stood up and looked around. The chamber was old in a way that the castle above him was old, but differently. The castle was old the way institutions are old, overlaid with use and repair and the traces of many people. The chamber was old the way a geological feature is old. It didn't know anyone had been using it. It had been waiting since Slytherin built it, patient and cold and indifferent, for someone to return. The stone snakes on the pillars were enormous. They lined the passage like an honor guard, mouths open, carved fangs permanently mid-strike. Harry walked between them and looked at each one, and the chamber looked back with the flat attention of stone. The basilisk was at the far end. It was asleep, or close enough to asleep that the distinction wasn't urgent, coiled among the ruins of its own shed skins, each skin the size of a road. It was extraordinary. That was the honest first impression. It was an extraordinary creature. 60 feet of muscle and scale and absolute, elemental killing power, its eyes closed, its breath the slow tidal movement of something that had its own weather system. The largest living serpent in Britain. Probably in Europe. Possibly anywhere. Harry stood at the edge of its coils and looked at it for a while. He had come tonight to look and to understand the geography and to plan. That was the plan. Look and return and bring the others back and figure out the rest. That was a reasonable, organized plan. Then the basilisk opened one eye. The eye was gold, and enormous, and for a fraction of a second, before Harry looked away on pure instinct, not fear but basic self-preservation, he saw the depth of it, the complete absence of anything that could be called consideration, the pure mechanical totality of what it was. The eye being open meant it had known he was here. It had known for some time. It had been waiting to see what he would do. Go, Harry said, in Parseltongue, and his voice in the chamber had an echo that came back wrong, layered, as if the stones themselves were translating. The basilisk's coils shifted. The head rose, 12 feet of neck, the head the size of a small car, the golden eyes now closed again, or not quite closed, the pupils tracking under the scale of a lid that wasn't quite shut. It was tasting the air. It was cataloguing him. It understood Parseltongue and it was deciding whether he was something that had authority over it or just something that could speak in its language. You have been killing, Harry said. A sound, not words, exactly, but the impression of words the way heat can be an impression of fire. Yes. You were told to. Yes. And then something that meant, by the old voice, the young voice, the voice in the water. Harry thought about this. The voice in the water was a new piece of information. He filed it. I'm going to close the chamber, he said. And you're going to go back to sleep. And no one else is going to die. The basilisk's head came fully up. The scales clicked against the stone floor as the coils tightened, a sound like a rockslide deciding where to go. It was not attacking. Not yet. It was considering. You are not the heir, it said. The impression of words, this time, had a question in it. No, Harry said. Then you have no authority to command me. I'm not commanding you, Harry said. I'm telling you what's going to happen. The head lowered slightly, sideways, the way a very large animal orients when it is recalculating. Harry reached, without deciding to, for stop time, and the chamber locked into golden silence, the basilisk mid-movement, the great head tilting, the coils still, the shed skins motionless around its frozen body. Harry walked forward. He walked to the head and stood beside it, in the stopped world, beside 60 feet of the most lethal creature in Europe, and put one hand on the scales behind the jaw. They were warm. He had not expected them to be warm, and the unexpected warmth of it landed somewhere in him with more weight than he'd anticipated. He looked at the closed eye. He thought about what was directing this creature. Not its own nature, it was a predator, it hunted, but this level of targeted attack on specific humans in specific locations required instruction. Something was giving it targets. The voice in the water. Tom Riddle's voice, from a memory in a diary, carrying enough of Voldemort's intent and power to speak to a basilisk through 50 years of waiting. The diary that Lucius Malfoy had put in Ginny Weasley's cauldron in Diagon Alley in August. The book that had fallen with a specific weight into a specific cauldron, a gift designed to destroy the recipient by reaching up into the giver's most dangerous available mechanism. Harry stood and stopped time beside a frozen basilisk and felt the whole architecture of it settle into place, and felt something that was not quite anger but was in the same family. Not hot anger, he didn't do hot anger. Cold anger. The anger of someone who has correctly identified what has been done and to whom and by whom and has now decided that the situation is going to be resolved. He let time go. The basilisk finished its tilt. Its head was now at Harry's level, its closed eye 6 inches from his face, its breath a gust of cold air that moved his hair. "Sleep," Harry said. "What you've been asked to do is finished. I'll deal with the rest." A long silence. The basilisk was very old and it had its own kind of intelligence, and it was running its own calculation in whatever way 60 feet of ancient serpent runs calculations. Then, slowly, the head lowered. The coils settled. The enormous body redistributed itself into the posture of something returning to dormancy, and Harry stood in the chamber of secrets while the basilisk went back to sleep and the stones dripped and the shed skins lay around him and the pillar snakes watched with carved gold eyes. He went back the way he'd come. The diary was the next morning. He had known about the diary since August and had been waiting for the right moment to address it, waiting not out of caution but because timing mattered and the right moment had not yet arrived. The right moment arrived on a Tuesday in December when he found Ginny Weasley in the library with the diary open in front of her and her eyes fixed on it with the glazed, hungry focus of someone who has been talking to something for months and has started to need it. Harry sat down across from her. She startled and closed the diary quickly with the specific guilt of someone who has been somewhere private. "How long have you had it?" Harry said. Ginny stared at him. She was 12 and she had red hair and she had Ron's directness without Ron's volume, and she looked at Harry the way everyone eventually looked at Harry, with the awareness that he already knew more than she'd said. "Since September," she said, very quietly. "Does it write back?" Her face was the answer. "Ginny," Harry said, "whoever is in that diary is not your friend." "He listens," she said, with the raw simplicity of someone saying the truest thing they know. "He understands. I can tell him anything and she stopped herself. Harry looked at her. He thought about a cupboard with 2 bolts on the outside and a drawing of a green blob and a yellow sun. He thought about the specific shape of loneliness that makes a person reach for whatever is available. He understood the mechanism exactly. "He's using you," Harry said, simply, without cruelty. "What he listens to, he files. He's been building something from what you've given him and he's been getting stronger every time you write in it." Ginny's hands tightened on the diary. "You don't know that. The basilisk has been attacking people he identified through you," Harry said. "Every person who's been petrified, he knew where they'd be. He knew because you told him about your schedule, your friends, your classmates." The color left her face completely. "I didn't know, I know you didn't," Harry said. "You were 12 and alone and someone offered to listen. That's not a character flaw. That's just being 12. He held out his hand. "Give it to me." She held the diary for another moment. The hold she had on it was more than physical, it was the hold of someone releasing something they have needed, and the need made the release hard. Then she put it in his hand. It was a plain black diary. It had T.M. Riddle on the cover in faded gold. Harry held it and felt the warmth of it, the animation, the presence inside, and remembered the face on the back of Quirrell's head, the red eyes, the voice that had been genuinely extraordinary even in ruin. "Go back to your dormitory," Harry told Ginny. "You're going to be fine." "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to have a conversation," Harry said. She left. Harry opened the diary to a blank page and wrote, "I know what you are." The ink disappeared. Then new ink formed, in a different handwriting, confident, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had practiced having good handwriting the way people practice having good everything when they haven't had anything. "And what am I?" "A fragment," Harry wrote. "A memory. Part of Tom Riddle at 16, preserved in a Horcrux." A pause. Longer than the previous one. Then, "You know about Horcruxes?" "Yes. Impressive, for a 12-year-old. I'm thorough, Harry wrote. I've been thinking about your soul architecture since June. Another pause. Then the ink shifted and thickened and the quality of the presence in the diary changed, the way a room changes when someone in it stops pretending and decides to be direct. What do you want, Harry Potter? I want to know how many there are, Harry wrote. The temperature in the library dropped by 2 degrees. The candle on Harry's table guttered. The ink on the page moved with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the hand that had originally written it. Why would I tell you that? Because I'm going to find them eventually, Harry wrote. And you know I will. And I'd rather this be a conversation than a search. And if I tell you? I'll deal with this quickly, Harry wrote. You won't drag. I'll be efficient. You're asking me to cooperate in my own destruction. I'm telling you that you're going to be destroyed, Harry wrote. I'm offering you the choice about how long it takes. The longest pause yet. Harry waited. He was very good at waiting. Outside the library window the grounds were grey with winter and a few students in Quidditch robes were flying practice patterns over the pitch and the world went about its business. 6. The diary wrote, finally. Including myself. Including the piece in your scar. Harry's quill stopped moving. He looked at the page. Then he wrote, my scar. He made one the night he killed your parents, the diary wrote, and there was something in the quality of the ink, something that was not satisfaction, not regret, not quite anything nameable. Unintentionally. The killing curse rebounded and fractured the soul and a piece embedded in you. Which makes you, technically, I know what it makes me, Harry wrote. Does it change anything? Harry looked at the word 6. He thought about it for a long moment. No, he wrote. It doesn't change anything. He stopped time. The diary froze. The presence inside it, which was not alive but was more than not alive, arrested in the golden silence. Harry reached into the stopped moment with the part of himself that lived in the between time, and he found the shape of the soul fragment inside the diary. It was extraordinary, to feel it like this, to touch the edges of it in stopped time. It had a texture. It had heat. It had the ghost of everything Tom Riddle had been at 16, the ambition, the extraordinary intelligence, the hunger that was always a few degrees too hot, the loneliness that had never had anywhere to go except inward. Harry felt something complicated about it. Not sympathy, not exactly. But the recognition he'd felt in the chamber, touching the warm scales of the basilisk. Things were what they were, and what this was a fragment of a human soul that had been placed in a book and used as a weapon, and the human who had placed it there had made choices that had brought everything to exactly this, and those choices deserved their consequences. He pressed forward with the stop-time essence of himself, the core of what DIO had given him, that root-level stillness that was also a kind of force, and he pushed it into the diary. The diary resisted. The soul fragment had mass and intention and it pushed back with the strength of a 16-year-old who had been exceptional and furious and very much not ready to be extinguished. Harry pushed harder. The diary's pages began to turn, in stopped time, impossible, with the world arrested, but this was a soul fragment doing it, something that existed partially outside the rules of stopped time. The pages turned frantically and stopped and turned again, and the handwriting on each page, all the entries Tom Riddle had ever written in it, decades of a young man's thoughts, began to bleed. The ink ran. The words distorted. The book shook. Harry stood over it with one hand pressed flat on the cover and stopped time held completely still around him and simply continued, with the quiet, absolute persistence that had been his central quality since he was 4 years old in a cupboard. The diary went still. The fragment was gone. He let time go. The book fell open to a blank page and the pages were all blank and the warmth was gone and it was just a book, a plain black book with T.M. Riddle in faded gold on the cover, and Harry closed it and held it for a moment. Then he stood up and left the library. He found Hermione in the corridor and handed her the diary. She turned it over, ran her wand over it twice, looked at him. "It's empty," she said. "Yes. How? Pushed the fragment out in stop time, he said. You, stop time inside a Horcrux. It took a few minutes, he said. Hermione stared at him. Harry, a Horcrux is the soul magic involved is some of the darkest, I know, he said. It's fine. Stop saying it's fine as though, there are 5 more, Harry said. She stopped. Processed. 5. Plus the one in my scar. The corridor was empty around them and Hermione was very still in the specific way she got when information landed that was large enough to require a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on his arm, not asking anything, not saying anything. Just contact. The acknowledgement of something that was too large to be useful to discuss standing in a corridor. Harry looked at her hand on his arm. He wasn't used to this, the contact, the offered weight of another person. He found it was not unwelcome. 6 total, she said finally. 6 total. Your scar is one of them. Yes. Which means to destroy them all, I know what it means, Harry said. I've thought about it. She didn't ask what conclusion he'd reached. She was smart enough to know that when he said he'd thought about it he meant he had thought about it completely, and that the conclusion existed, and that he had filed it under eventual with the calm of someone who doesn't waste energy on problems before they're the next problem. She let go of his arm. What do we do now? She asked. Find the others, Harry said. Not now. Not this year. But find them. He paused. And figure out the scar. One at a time, Hermione said. One at a time, he agreed. They walked back toward the common room through the castle that was still slightly too cold and still slightly too afraid, but less so than yesterday. The basilisk was asleep and the diary was empty and the attacks were over and the school would figure that out by morning. Harry walked and thought about the 5 remaining fragments and the one in his own skull and the voice the diary had had, that extraordinary voice, even in fragments, even in ink, the voice of someone who had been given everything exceptional and had used it to become afraid of death, and felt the stop-time hum in his blood, the gold ring hum, and thought, I am not afraid of death. I am what happens in the space between moments. I am what exists when everything else stops. Let him come. The castle's torches burned on either side of them as they walked. Harry's shadow stretched behind him on the flagstones, long and clear in the torchlight, and the stones were cold and the year was almost done and there were 5 more objects in the world that needed his attention and a headmaster upstairs who watched everything and was going to need to be addressed eventually. Eventually, Harry thought. First things first. Chapter 5, The Tournament and the Threshold. The years between 2nd and 4th moved the way years move when you are building something, not fast, not slow, but with the accumulating weight of progress that only becomes visible when you look back at where you started. 3rd year gave Harry the Patronus, which was not something he expected to have difficulty with and then did. The Dementors at the station, the first time, he had felt them as a cold that was different from other colds, not external but sourced, as if the temperature was being generated somewhere behind his sternum. The cold moved through his stop-time ability the way weather moves through walls, finding the gaps, and for a fraction of a second on the train platform he had felt not fear but something adjacent to it, the sensation of something reaching into him and pulling at the root of his power, testing the architecture. He had stopped time reflexively and the Dementor had paused, mid-glide, and in the frozen golden silence he had felt the cold recede. He let time go and the cold resumed and he understood the mechanism. Dementors operated on something outside the physical, but they were still physical enough to be affected by stop time, at least partially, at least for the duration of the stop. Lupin had taught him the Patronus charm in private sessions that Harry had requested, because Lupin was the first defense teacher who knew what he was talking about and Harry intended to use that while it lasted. The Patronus took him 3 sessions to produce, not because of the power requirement but because of the memory requirement, the necessity of reaching for something genuinely happy, and the discovery that his supply of genuinely happy memories was, while not empty, more curated than he'd realized. He had good moments. He had Hermione's handwriting in the margins of a letter. He had Neville's postcard with the plant. He had the night in the Burrow kitchen with the enormous breakfast. He had Frost landing on his arm in the Olary and choosing him before he'd chosen her. He chose the Olary. The Patronus came out silver white and enormous, not an animal exactly, or not just an animal. It had the shape of a stag, which surprised him, but its edges were wrong for something that lived in linear time. It flickered at the margins. It moved with the quality of something that occupied several consecutive seconds simultaneously. Lupin had looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "I've never seen a Patronus do that," Lupin said finally. "Do what?" "Flicker," Lupin said. "Like it's moving through time rather than space." "It might be," Harry said. Lupin had one of those faces that showed intelligence the way water shows depth, you only saw it fully when something passed through it. He looked at Harry with the depth-showing expression and said, very carefully, "How long have you had the time ability?" "Since I was 4, Harry said. "And it's connected to your magic?" "It is my magic," Harry said. "At this point I can't fully separate them." Lupin absorbed this with the composure of a man who had lived through enough extraordinary things that his baseline for extraordinary had shifted considerably. "Does Dumbledore know?" Harry looked at him. "Right," Lupin said. "Of course he does." Third year also gave him Sirius Black, who turned out to be his godfather and innocent and was a man who had been compressed by 12 years of Azkaban into something more elemental than he'd probably been before. Harry had liked him immediately, the way you like a wildfire, with the awareness that it had no temperature settings and genuinely no interest in acquiring them. They had sat in the shrieking shack and Sirius had told him about his parents and Harry had listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he'd been waiting a long time to receive. He had also, in the shack, seen the Patronus flicker and stop a Dementor for the first time under real conditions, and the Dementor had recoiled from the stopped moment with the specific quality of something that had reached for an energy source and found a wall. It had not been afraid, Dementors didn't do afraid. But it had retreated, and that was sufficient. Sirius had been taken and then retrieved, a night involving time turners and Hermione and a flight on a hippogriff and Harry doing more with 3 hours of stop time than the Ministry had done with 6 months of investigation. He had thought about telling Hermione that she didn't need the time turner but had decided that letting her carry it was both simpler and more honest, she would have derived less satisfaction from the rescue if she hadn't felt her own hand in it. Sirius had gotten away on Buckbeak, which was the correct outcome, and Pettigrew had escaped, which was not, and Harry had filed Pettigrew under problems deferred alongside the Horcruxes and the Dumbledore question and several other items on the list he kept in the back of his mind, organized not by urgency but by inevitability. Fourth year began with the World Cup, which was the first time Harry had seen what a genuinely large gathering of wizards looked like when the pretense of normalcy was suspended. It was enormous and loud and Quidditch-shaped, and he went with the Weasleys and sat in the top box and watched Ireland and Bulgaria play one of the finest Quidditch matches he'd ever seen, and then the night happened. The dark mark in the sky. The masked figures moving through the campsite with the patient methodology of people who had been given permission to do this once before and had been waiting for the permission to return. Harry had stood outside the tent and watched the green skull and the serpent hang over the burning campsite and felt the cold anger, not hot, never hot, move through him. He stopped time. In the golden silence he walked through the frozen crowd of fleeing witches and wizards, frozen mid-run, mid-stumble, hands raised against a light that wasn't moving, and he moved toward the masked figures with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere else to be. 12 of them, roughly. Moving through the campsite in a spreading line, wands out, not casting but having cast, the spells already done and hanging in the stopped air above the tents. A family suspended mid-air, rotating, the Death Eaters' wands pointing up, their masked faces turned toward their work. Harry looked at them one by one. He memorized the builds, the heights, the specific way each of them stood, the cut of their robes, the manner of their masks. He did this thoroughly. He did not act, because acting here was not the move. There were 12 of them and the Ministry was arriving and the strategic value of a single confrontation with masked figures whose identities he'd memorized was less than the strategic value of maintaining his unknown status until it was relevant. He noted which of the 12 had the build of Lucius Malfoy, because of course he did, and he noted which stood with the particular posture of someone very recently returned to something they had been made to give up. He let time go. He walked back through the chaos to the tent and arrived there before anyone who had been running made it back, and he sat down on the tent floor and looked at his hands and thought about the mark in the sky and the specific, deliberate cruelty of people who did this sort of thing in public. He thought about Voldemort's soul fragments, all 5 of them still intact, distributed across the country like a contingency plan. He thought about the architecture of someone who made themselves immortal through destruction, and the way that architecture required constant maintenance, required, specifically, that other people be afraid. He was not afraid. But he was, sitting on the tent floor in the dark, something else. He was decided. He had been decided before, about specific things. This was broader. He had decided, on a tent floor in the dark while a green skull faded from the sky, that this was going to end, and that he was going to be the one who ended it. And that when it ended it would end on his terms and not Dumbledore's terms and not Voldemort's terms and not the terms of any prophecy or plan or institutional framework that had been treating him as a variable in someone else's equation since before he was old enough to understand what an equation was. He was Harry Potter. He had been given stop time and a wand that chose stillness and 11 years of absolute self-reliance, and the world had been moving without his permission for long enough. Hogwarts that September had a different quality, the anticipatory quality of a place that was expecting something. The announcement of the Triwizard Tournament came at the welcome feast with the particular energy of Dumbledore delivering news he had been holding back until it would land correctly, and Harry listened and noted the details. 3 schools. 3 champions. 1 winner. Eternal glory. An age restriction, 17, the legal magical majority, enforced by the Goblet of Fire. Harry turned this over in his mind and decided, without particular intensity of feeling, that it had nothing to do with him. He was 14. He was not entering. He had enough on his agenda. The other schools arrived, Beauxbatons in a fleet of carriages drawn by winged horses, Durmstrang by a ship that surfaced in the lake like a thought becoming visible. The Beauxbatons contingent walked into the hall with a physical grace that had the quality of being trained rather than natural, and the Durmstrang contingent walked in with the energy of people who had been encouraged to seem dangerous and had decided to be good at it. Victor Crumb was with them, 17 and recognizable and apparently completely unbothered by recognition, which Harry noted approvingly. Cedric Diggory was the Hogwarts champion, chosen by the Goblet on the night of selection with the serious grace of someone who had wanted this specifically and had prepared for it specifically and who carried the weight of expectation without being crushed by it. He shook hands with Harry in the corridor the next morning and Harry found him straightforwardly likable, no performance, no pretension, just a 17-year-old who was good at things and knew it without needing to demonstrate it constantly. Then the Goblet produced a 4th name. Harry heard his name in Dumbledore's voice and felt the specific quality of the moment, the silence in the hall, then the noise, then the particular dense silence underneath the noise, and Hermione's hand closing on his arm, and Ron's face, which went through 3 consecutive expressions in under 2 seconds. He looked at the parchment in Dumbledore's hand and thought, someone put my name in. Not, how do I get out of this? Not, I'm afraid. Just, someone put my name in, which means someone wants me in this tournament, which means this tournament is a mechanism for something that ends with me somewhere specific, and I need to know who and where and why. He walked to the anteroom with the 3 existing champions and fielded the hostile energy of Fleur Delacour, who was magnificent and furious in equal measure, her anger the clean fury of someone who felt cheated rather than threatened, and Victor Crumb, who looked at Harry with the evaluating expression of an athlete sizing up unexpected competition, and Cedric, who looked troubled in the way of someone who knew Harry and couldn't make the situation resolve into something that felt fair. I didn't enter, Harry said, to the room. The Goblet chose you, Fleur said. I know, Harry said. Someone put my name in. You are 14, she said. You cannot have entered yourself. I know, Harry said again. Then who? I don't know yet, Harry said. But I will. She looked at him. She had the most direct gaze of anyone he'd met this year, blue and assessing, and it found his eyes and stayed there and she was deciding something. You are very calm for someone who has been forced into a life-threatening competition, she said. I've been in life-threatening situations before, Harry said. They end. Victor Crumb made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and involuntary. He looked at Harry and said nothing, but the look had recalibrated, and the recalibration said, interesting. Cedric said, quietly, be careful, Harry. I'll be fine, Harry said. Cedric nodded, with the steady gravity of someone who had been told this and was deciding, on faith, to believe it. The champions left. Harry stayed. He stood in the empty anteroom and thought about who wanted him in a tournament designed to be dangerous, and what the end of the tournament looked like, and what was waiting at the end. He thought about Pettigrew, still unaccounted for, still carrying the knowledge of Voldemort's location. He thought about the dream he'd had at the end of last year, a chair in a dark house, a man and a snake and a voice giving instructions. He stood and thought, and then he went back to the hall. The year moved around the tournament in the way that years move around large events, everything else conducting itself in the orbit of the thing. Hermione started SPW, which Harry supported not because he agreed with every element of her methodology. He thought she was approaching how self-liberation with the framework of someone who had been oppressed and was projecting the solution, but because her core argument was correct and her commitment to it was genuine, and he was not in the business of discouraging correct commitments. Ron had a period of distance from Harry that lasted approximately 2 weeks, the result of the particular pain of feeling left behind by someone you've chosen to be close to, and Harry let him have the 2 weeks because it was real and Ron needed to resolve it rather than be talked out of it. When Ron came back, he came back with the completeness of someone who has resolved something internally rather than been persuaded out of it, and their dynamic was, after that, more honest than it had been before. He identified Bartemius Crouch Jr. in his second month, approximately 6 weeks after the term began. The fake Moody, the converted Auror professor who drank from his flask with suspicious frequency and whose magical eye moved in ways that didn't quite match the behavior of a prosthetic that had forgotten it was a prosthetic, had the same quality of wrongness as Quirrell, but different in texture. Quirrell had been one person being replaced by another, the wrongness of a container fighting its contents. Crouch was the wrongness of a person who had decided what they were and had committed to it entirely, a true believer, the most dangerous kind, whose wrongness was not contamination but conviction. Harry spent a month observing him before acting on the observation, because the tournament was the mechanism and Crouch was the driver, and touching the mechanism before he understood the destination was inefficient. The first task was dragons. Harry had been told about the dragon by Hagrid, enormous, unsubtle Hagrid who could keep no secrets from Harry because he was constitutionally incapable of keeping secrets from anyone he cared about, and had stood at the edge of the enclosure and stopped time and looked at the Hungarian horntail for several minutes at close range with the same calm he had used to look at the basilisk. The dragon was magnificent. He noted this with the same honesty he'd noted it about the basilisk, the same acknowledgement that the thing trying to kill you could still be extraordinary. It was magnificent and it was protecting its eggs, and it was going to be placed in an arena in front of a crowd and asked to fail at the thing it was most fundamentally trying to do, which was an arrangement that produced in Harry something colder than his usual cold anger. He flew the task. He got the egg in 4 minutes, using the horntail's own aggression as a vector rather than a problem. He banked into the dive, let the dragon commit to the strike, stopped time for the 2 seconds he needed to change angle, and the horntail's momentum carried it past him while he collected the egg from a nest that was momentarily undefended. 4 minutes. The crowd's noise was enormous and the judges' scores were tens, and he landed and gave the egg to a handler and walked off the arena without performing anything. Fleur touched his arm as he came off. 4 minutes, she said. The dragon was fast, Harry said. I needed to use the stop. She looked at him. She had been watching since the anteroom, he knew, watching with the focused assessment of someone who had identified something and was still building a complete picture. The stop, she repeated. You stopped time. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Around them the handlers were managing the dragon, which was still furious and magnificent in the arena. How, she said. It's what I am, Harry said. She looked at him with those direct blue eyes and nodded once, the nod of someone who has received a piece of information and placed it in its correct location and does not need more from this specific conversation. Good, she said. The second task will be different. I know, he said. She nodded again and went to be congratulated by her headmistress, and Harry went to find Hermione, who had watched the whole thing from the stands with her hands in her lap and an expression that was the contained version of every emotion she'd felt in the 4 minutes it had taken. 4 minutes, she said. You said that at the station in 3rd year, Harry said. About the Dementor. Things take the time they take. The dragon, she said. Harry, it was a dragon, it was fine, he said, and she made the noise she made when she wanted to argue with him and couldn't find the argument, and they walked back to the castle together. The second task was water, and what was taken was Hermione. He stood at the edge of the lake on a grey February morning and felt the information land differently from how he'd expected. He had prepared for the task mechanically, gillyweed, identified through research he and Hermione had conducted together, procured through Neville who had shown, over the years, an encyclopedic knowledge of magical plants that was becoming genuinely impressive. He had been ready. What he hadn't prepared for was standing at the lake and feeling the particular cold of her absence, Hermione, who was somewhere at the bottom under a sleeping enchantment, placed there without her consent as a tournament prop, and having it matter in a way that cut underneath the practicality of the situation and landed somewhere he didn't have a full name for yet. He went in. The gillyweed worked and he moved through the lake with the altered body of someone temporarily between forms, faster than walking, slower than flying. The lake floor was dark and cold and full of the life of a very large body of water that had been established long enough to develop its own ecosystem and opinions about visitors. He found them at the statue, 4 people suspended in the lake's hold, anchored by enchanted weed. Hermione. Ron. Fleur's sister, small and red-haired. Victor's girl from Durmstrang. The Grindylows that patrolled the perimeter were a problem he solved with stop time and a redirected current that he generated himself, using the stopped moment to shift the water's motion so that when time resumed the Grindylows were moving away from him rather than toward him. He cut Hermione free first. He held her and cut Ron free. He considered the other 2 and thought about Fleur, who had not made it to this point. He'd passed her on the way down, turned back by Grindylows, and cut Fleur's sister free because the logic was simple, it wasn't her fault and he was here. The Durmstrang girl was Victor's to carry, and Victor arrived 40 seconds after Harry made this calculation and took her. He surfaced with Hermione and Ron, one on each arm, and got them to the bank and they coughed lake water and Hermione opened her eyes and looked at him with the waterlogged expression of someone who is still in the process of understanding what has happened. You came, she said. Of course, he said. She looked at him, at his face, which was close to hers because they were both on the bank and she was still catching her breath, and said nothing else. But the look had a quality to it that Harry registered with the same careful attention he registered everything, and filed under a category he had recently established and was still organizing. He got second on the task, behind Cedric. He hadn't been racing Cedric. The third task was a maze. Harry stood at the entrance in June with the other 3 champions and looked at the hedgerows that had been grown overnight from nothing to the height of 12 feet, and he felt the wrongness of the night the way he'd felt it before every significant thing, not as fear but as recognition. Here it is. He went in. The maze had creatures, a scrut that he stopped time around without difficulty, a boggart that took the shape of a Dementor and then, when he didn't react with fear, seemed to lose confidence and became something else, something without a fixed form, something that didn't know how to be frightening to someone who was not afraid of anything it could reach for. It cycled through shapes and Harry watched it cycle and then cast the ridiculous charm and it became Snape wearing Neville's grandmother's hat, which was Ron's joke from 3rd year and which Harry found, privately, slightly funny. He found Cedric at the center. Cedric had the cup in his hands and he turned when Harry arrived and his face was the face of someone who had been through something and was glad to see a familiar one. Harry, he said. You're all right? Harry said. Yes. Just, take the cup, we'll take it together, Harry said. Cedric looked at him. You don't have to, Cedric, Harry said, I'm telling you. Take it together. Something in his voice, the quality that said I know something you don't, listen, reached Cedric, who looked at the cup and then at Harry with the intelligence of someone putting pieces together without having all of them. What happens when we take it? Something I'm going to need to deal with, Harry said. Something that's better if you're not there for. But I can't tell you not to grab it without telling you why, and if I tell you why it changes your night in a way that, he stopped. Trust me. I trust you, Cedric said, without hesitating. Then when we land, wherever we land, you run, Harry said. Whatever you see, whatever happens, you run and you get back to the cup and you come home. Do you understand? Cedric looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. Are you going to be all right? Yes, Harry said. You always say that. And I'm always right, Harry said, and Cedric smiled, and they took the cup together. The graveyard was exactly what a graveyard in June looked like, dark and cold and real and ordinary in the way that places that have only one function are always ordinary. Old headstones. Long grass between the rows. A church in the distance, dark at this hour. The sky clear and full of stars. Cedric ran. Harry watched him go and turned. Pettigrew was already moving. The bundle in his arms, the thing that was Voldemort, not yet a body, barely a form, the concentrated soul of someone who had held himself together through sheer terrifying will for 13 years, was being carried to the cauldron. Harry noted Pettigrew's specific quality of wrongness. The man was afraid and ashamed and going ahead anyway, which was its own particular kind of horror. Harry Potter, Pettigrew said, and his voice was the voice of a man apologizing for something he intended to do regardless. Where's Voldemort? Harry said. The bundle hissed. Pettigrew flinched. Then the ritual, the preparation, the horrible grammar of it, bone and flesh and blood, and Harry watched the cauldron and felt the moment before the resurrection with the full attention of someone who has been waiting for this specific confrontation for 3 years and has prepared for it in every way he knows how. Voldemort rose from the cauldron. He was extraordinary, even now, even in the first moment of recorporealization, shaking, white as bone, with eyes like 2 coals that had never gone out. He looked at his hands. He looked at the sky. He breathed, and the breath was the first breath of someone who had been not breathing for 13 years and found the air exactly as they remembered it. Then he looked at Harry. The red eyes found him and there was a moment, brief, real, of absolute mutual recognition. Not combat. Not threat. Something cleaner than that. The recognition of 2 things that had been approaching this point from opposite directions for Harry's entire life. Harry Potter, Voldemort said, and his voice was everything the diary's impression of a voice had been and more, resonant, beautiful, carrying the quality of someone who had never in their life spoken without intending to be heard. You look well. You look better than the turban, Harry said. Voldemort's expression moved. He looked at Harry with the specific attention of someone encountering a thing that isn't behaving the way the briefing said it would. You're not afraid, he said. No, Harry said. You should be, Voldemort said, and it was not a threat, it was an observation, the tone of someone correcting a factual error. I've heard that before, Harry said. It's not a persuasive argument. The Death Eaters operate in a ring. They came from the dark like punctuation, one by one, drawn by the dark mark that Pettigrew had fired into the sky, and they materialized in a circle around the graveyard with the quiet coordination of people who had been waiting for this specific night for years. 23 of them. 30. Harry counted without counting, in the way of someone who tracks a room automatically. Voldemort walked toward him and Harry stood and watched him come. I have something to tell you, Voldemort said. He was close now, 10 feet. His eyes were very bright. I know what you are. I know about the fragment in your scar. I know about the man who made you what you are. I know that you have power over time, and I know, he paused, and the pause was deliberate, the pause of a man who understands the weight of information as a weapon, that it won't save you from a killing curse. You've tried that once, Harry said. Different circumstances, Voldemort said. Different me. He raised his wand. I want to duel you, Harry. Not as a demonstration for my followers. As a test. I want to know what you are. You won't get a long duel, Harry said. No, Voldemort agreed, and there was something in his voice that was genuine, the genuine interest of someone who had spent his entire existence hunting power and had found something he couldn't categorize. I don't expect one. The killing curse came without further preamble. Harry stopped time. The green light froze in the air between them. It hung there, 3 feet from Harry's chest, frozen, the color of something that had no business being a color, suspended in the golden silence of stop time. Harry looked at it. He could feel the edge of it in stop time, the way you feel the heat from a fire without touching it. The stop time field pushed against it and the killing curse pushed back. It was not fully physical, the killing curse, it was something that existed in the gap between physics and something else, and stopping time caught most of it but not all of it, and the not all of it pressure in his chest was the most he had felt from anything in years. He stepped to the left. He let time go. The killing curse hit the headstone behind where he'd been standing and the stone exploded and the Death Eaters who had been watching a duel watched Harry Potter step out of a killing curse and stand with his wand up and his expression unchanged and not one of them moved for 3 full seconds. Voldemort looked at where his curse had landed. He looked at Harry. For the first time in the graveyard, for the first time that Harry had ever seen in any iteration of this face, something moved in the red eyes that was not anger, not calculation, not the burning intelligence that never went out. It was close to wonder. Fascinating, Voldemort said. The fragment in my scar, Harry said. You should know, I'm aware of it. I've been aware of it since 2nd year. And I've been thinking about what it means. Voldemort went still. What conclusion did you reach? That you made a mistake, Harry said. Not the obvious mistake. The fundamental one. You made yourself afraid of death, so you made yourself a contingency plan, and the contingency plan means there are 6 versions of you scattered across the country in objects that can be found and destroyed. You traded omnivulnerability for a kind of distributed vulnerability that requires much more maintenance. He paused. It was a poor trade. Voldemort looked at him. You've been destroying them, he said. It was not a question. One so far, Harry said. The diary. The Death Eaters were still. The night was very quiet. Voldemort and Harry stood across from each other in a graveyard in June with a destroyed headstone between them and 30 people watching and the sky full of stars that had been there long before either of them and would be there long after. You intend to kill me, Voldemort said. Eventually, Harry said. Not tonight. Why not tonight? Because you just came back, Harry said, and I want you to have enough time to remember what being alive feels like before it ends. The Death Eaters reacted. The circle tightened. Wands raised. Voldemort raised one hand and the circle stopped, and the hand gesture carried the absolute authority of someone who had not lost the habit of being obeyed. You are remarkable, Voldemort said softly. I'm going home, Harry said. I haven't dismissed you. I know, Harry said. I'm going anyway. He turned and walked toward the cup and the world erupted. 23 spells hit the air where he had been standing and Harry was 6 feet to the left of where he'd been, in stop time, and he let time go and the spells hit a headstone and each other and the grass and a rowan tree that had done nothing wrong, and he was already at the cup. He looked back. Voldemort stood in the center of his ring of Death Eaters and looked at him with the expression of someone watching a door close on something they intended to follow through. Until next time, Harry said. He took the cup. He arrived back on the tournament grounds to noise and light in Dumbledore's face, which was the face of a man who had been waiting for a specific outcome and received a different one. He landed on his feet. He released the cup. He looked at the crowd and the champions and the teachers and the lights and then he looked at Dumbledore directly and held the look. Dumbledore looked back with those half-moon glasses and the blue eyes behind them that saw everything and filed everything and had been running their own calculations about Harry Potter since the night in the Great Hall when the candles stopped. "He's back," Harry said, to Dumbledore, for the crowd's benefit. "Voldemort is back." The crowd's noise changed shape. "Are you all right?" Dumbledore asked, and his voice had the warmth in it that was genuine. Harry had long since decided that the warmth was real, that it coexisted with the calculation, that Dumbledore was not a man who faked care but was a man who considered care and strategy to be the same currency. "Yes," Harry said. "Harry, we'll talk," Harry said. "But not tonight." He looked at Dumbledore and the look was the first fully direct exchange they had ever had, not the glances across the Great Hall, not the aftermath of first year in the dark of the chamber, not any of the intermediate moments. This was a conversation happening entirely in eye contact, and what it said was, "I know what you've been doing. I know what I am to your plan. That conversation is coming and it will be honest." Dumbledore held the look. Then he nodded, once, the nod of a man who has recognized an inevitable conversation and is choosing the timing carefully. Harry walked through the crowd toward Hermione, who met him halfway and didn't say anything. She put her hand in his and he let her and they stood in the noise of a tournament ending and a war beginning, and Harry looked at the sky. The stars hadn't moved. He thought about Voldemort in the graveyard, the wonder in the red eyes, the voice that was extraordinary even in a body it had just reacquired. He thought about the Death Eaters in their ring. He thought about the fragment in his scar, the sixth piece, the piece that was going to require a kind of solution that he had been sitting with for 2 years and had not yet fully resolved. He thought about time. About the stopped world, the golden silence, the between space where nothing moved but him. He was 14 years old. He had 5 Horcruxes left to find and a war beginning around him and a headmaster who intended to manage him and a dark lord in a graveyard who had looked at him with something close to wonder and said fascinating. He was not afraid of any of it. He was Harry Potter. He was the thing in the between space. He was the stillness at the center of everything moving. The stars hung above him and the crowd moved around him and Hermione's hand was in his and the world, as always, went forward. He let it go forward. For now. Chapter 6, The God Decides. The summer after the tournament was the summer Dumbledore stopped pretending. He arrived at Privet Drive on a Tuesday evening in July, unannounced, with the particular quality of a man who had decided that the time for indirection had run its course. Harry was in his room reading when the knock came at the front door and he heard Vernon's voice go through its usual sequence, aggressive, then uncertain, then the specific register of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit his framework and is deciding very quickly to stop pushing. Then footsteps on the stairs, and a knock at Harry's door that was not Vernon's knock. Harry set down his book. "Come in." Dumbledore opened the door and stood in the frame of it and looked at the room, the books stacked with the precision of someone who had organized them by subject and then by relevance within subject, the notes in Harry's hand spread across the desk, Frost asleep on her perch with one eye slightly open. He looked at Harry, who was sitting on his bed with his legs crossed and his expression open and entirely without surprise. "You knew I was coming," Dumbledore said. "I expected you'd come eventually," Harry said. "This summer or next. Sit down." There was one chair. Dumbledore sat in it with the slightly bemused quality of a man who was accustomed to setting the tone of his visits and had just had the tone set by a 15-year-old. He placed his hands on his knees and looked at Harry over his half-moon glasses and Harry looked back with the patient directness of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for 4 years and was not going to be the first one to blink. "You wanted to talk," Dumbledore said. "You wanted to talk," Harry said. "I've been available." A pause. Outside, the Dursleys' garden was quiet in the evening light, Vernon apparently having decided that whatever was in his house was best addressed by pretending the house contained only himself. "You've known what I was doing," Dumbledore said. "Not a question." "Since first year," Harry said. "The stone was bait. The corridor was a test. You wanted to know who would go after it and how. It was somewhat more nuanced than, you wanted to know what I was," Harry said. Whether I was what you'd been told I'd be. Whether the prophecy held. He kept his voice level. You've been running a long experiment and I've been the primary subject. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. In the quiet, the evening settled around the house, a lawnmower 3 gardens away, a car passing on the street outside, the ordinary world conducting its ordinary business against the backdrop of a conversation about prophecy and power and the deliberate shaping of a child's life. I want to explain my reasoning, Dumbledore said. I'd like that, Harry said. Go ahead. This, apparently, was not the response Dumbledore had prepared for. He had prepared for anger, Harry suspected, had prepared for the justified adolescent fury of someone who had just been told the shape of the cage they'd been in. He had not prepared for calm and he had not prepared for go-ahead delivered with the tone of a judge inviting opening arguments. He told the story. He told it honestly, and Harry gave him credit for that, for not prettifying the decisions, for not softening the arithmetic. A prophecy, made before Harry was born, that said neither could live while the other survived. The decision to place Harry with the Dursleys, their blood connection to Lily, the ancient protection it offered, the need to keep him unknown and safe until the time came. The decision to let certain things reach Harry, to let certain tests happen, to see what the boy would do. I underestimated you, Dumbledore said, and the simplicity of it landed cleanly, without ornament. Repeatedly. And deliberately. Deliberately, Harry said. I was afraid, Dumbledore said, of what you were becoming. Not with fear for myself. With the fear of a man who has seen what happens when someone with extraordinary power decides they are outside the need for guidance. You were afraid I'd become Voldemort, Harry said. The parallel is not, it's exactly what you were afraid of, Harry said. A child from an abusive home, exceptional power, no normal attachment to the rules of the world. He tilted his head slightly. I understand the reasoning. It's not completely wrong. As a category of person to be cautious about, I can see how I fit the profile. Dumbledore looked at him. You're not angry, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not relief and not disappointment but a form of genuine curiosity, the curiosity of a man encountering an outcome he hadn't modeled. I was angry in 2nd year, Harry said. 3rd year I was mostly busy. By 4th year the anger had been around long enough that I could see it clearly and decide what to do with it. He paused. I decided not to let it make decisions for me. That is, mature, yes, you can say it, Harry said, not unkindly. I've had a lot of time to practice. The cupboard was very quiet. He let the sentence sit in the air for a moment, not as accusation but as fact. You left me there on purpose. The protection required, I know what the protection required, Harry said. You made a strategic choice. I'm not interested in relitigating it. I'm interested in whether you understand what it produced. Dumbledore was quiet. It produced someone who doesn't need you, Harry said. Someone who doesn't need your guidance or your management or your plan. I built everything I am in that cupboard and on that street and in this room, and the things I built don't have a dependency on your approval or your institutional framework or Gryffindor House or the Wizarding World's idea of what a savior is supposed to look like. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. That's what you were afraid of. But here's what I need you to understand, it's not a problem. It's the answer. Dumbledore turned his teacup in his hands. Harry had made tea somewhere in the 2nd paragraph of the explanation, the habitual hospitality of someone who had been raised by people who thought tea was the appropriate response to any situation, and the habit had stuck. He turned it and looked at the tea and looked at Harry. The Horcruxes, Dumbledore said. 6, Harry said. Diary is gone. 5 remaining, plus the fragment in my scar. Dumbledore's eyes were very still behind the glasses. You know about your scar. Since 2nd year, Harry said. The diary told me. A breath. I discovered it only recently, Dumbledore said, and this was, Harry could tell, genuinely difficult for him, not because it reflected badly on his competence, but because it had implications for the plan he had built, for the shape of the ending he had been constructing, for the thing he had decided would have to happen and had been deciding how to tell Harry. "I was working toward telling you." "What were you going to tell me?" Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he said it, that at some point, for Voldemort to be destroyed, the fragment within you would need to be destroyed too. The room was quiet. "You were going to tell me I had to die," Harry said. "I was going to tell you," Dumbledore said carefully, "that the prophecy and the Horcrux architecture together seemed to suggest that I had to die," Harry said. Dumbledore didn't answer, which was the answer. Harry looked at him. He looked at this extraordinary man, brilliant, genuine in his care, committed to the world's safety with a sincerity that was not performative, who had nonetheless spent 15 years arranging a child like a piece on a board and moving him toward a square that required his sacrifice. He looked at him and felt the cold anger move through him, and he let it move through him, cleanly, without letting it into his voice. "The fragment in my scar," Harry said, "is not a permanent feature of my architecture. I've been working on it for 2 years. Dumbledore blinked. "Working on it, in stop time," Harry said. "The same way I removed the fragment from the diary. In stop time I can find the edges of it. I can feel its shape. What I couldn't do at 12, because I didn't have the control, I can do now." He paused. "I need a week. Possibly 2. Dumbledore stared at him. It was the first time Harry had seen him stare, the first time the composure had gone all the way to its root and come up empty. "You intend to remove the Horcrux from your own scar," he said. "Without dying." "I don't intend to die," Harry said. "I never intended to die. Anyone's plan that involved me dying was a plan I wasn't going to follow." "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice had dropped, had gone to something underneath the authority and the warmth and the calculation, something older, something that was just a man who had been carrying this for a very long time. "I need you to understand the complexity of what you're proposing. A Horcrux is not simply the soul magic, I stopped time inside the diary," Harry said. "It tried to push back. I pushed harder. The fragment in my scar has been inside me for 15 years and I've been touching it in stop time since second year, and I know its shape better than I know most things." He looked at Dumbledore. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you the plan." A long silence. Then Dumbledore said, very quietly, "All right." Harry looked at him. "All right," Dumbledore said again, and there was something in the 2 words that had weight, the weight of a plan being set down, of a 15-year calculation being acknowledged as superseded. "What do you need?" "The locations of the remaining Horcruxes," Harry said. "I know you've been researching them. I know you have leads. I need those leads." "I have 3 confirmed locations," Dumbledore said. "And 2 strong theories." "Tell me all of them." Dumbledore told him. He spoke for an hour and Harry listened without interrupting, with the complete and cataloguing attention he had brought to everything important since he was old enough to understand that attention was the first resource and the cheapest one. He noted the locket, Slytherin's locket, trailed to a cave on the coast that Dumbledore had already investigated and found empty. The locket moved on. The cup, Helga Hufflepuff's, in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts. The diadem, Ravenclaw's lost diadem, likely within Hogwarts itself, in a room Dumbledore had theories about. The snake, Nagini, Voldemort's familiar, which was almost certainly the 6th Horcrux and which lived where Voldemort lived. The locket, Harry said. "Do you know where it went after the cave?" "I have a suspicion," Dumbledore said. "Mundungus Fletcher acquired several items from the Black family house last year. One of them matched the description." "Sirius's house," Harry said. "Regulus Black," Dumbledore said. "I believe Regulus discovered what the locket was and attempted to destroy it himself. I believe he failed and hid it, and it found its way eventually to Grimmauld Place." Harry thought about Regulus Black, 17 years old, realizing what he had joined, realizing what the man he'd followed had done, going back to the cave alone to try to put something right. He thought about this for a moment and then filed it in the place where he kept things that deserved acknowledgement. "I'll start with the locket," Harry said. "The cup will require Gringotts, which I can manage. The diadem I can find at Hogwarts. Nagini is last, she'll be with Voldemort and I'm not going to Voldemort until I'm ready to finish it." "And your scar," Dumbledore said. "First," Harry said. "Everything else after." Dumbledore looked at him, the full look, the look with all of its extraordinary depth directed at one person without the management layer, without the strategy layer, just the full honest attention of a man who had spent 15 years looking at Harry Potter and was, possibly for the first time, seeing him without the frame of the prophecy around him. "You are not what I expected," Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "What did you expect?" "A weapon," Dumbledore said simply. "A very powerful weapon that I would need to aim carefully." He paused. "I am sorry, Harry. For the weapon-shaped thinking." Harry looked at him. The apology was real, he could tell, had always been able to tell the difference between real and performed with people, it was one of the skills the cupboard had given him. He accepted it the way he accepted real things. "Don't apologize," Harry said. "Just don't do it anymore." The scar took 9 days. He did it in the summer quiet of his room at Privet Drive, alone, in the early hours when the house was sleeping and the street was dark. He sat with his back against the wall and went inward, not meditation exactly, not any formal technique, just the practiced act of turning stop time on himself, which was something he had been working toward for 2 years and had been afraid of for reasons he'd only recently fully identified. He had been afraid, not of the pain, but of the fragment itself. Of touching Tom Riddle's soul and finding something there that resonated with him, the way the diary had resonated, the way Voldemort's voice had resonated in the graveyard. The fear that the recognition would go both ways. That reaching in might mean something reaching back. On the first night he stopped time and reached and found the fragment's edge and immediately let time go and sat in the dark breathing. Not because it had hurt. Because it had felt familiar, and the familiarity was more disturbing than pain would have been. On the second night he stayed longer. He examined the shape of it, the Voldemort-shaped darkness that had been in the back of his skull for 15 years, older than his own memory of himself, part of the architecture of who he was before he was old enough to know who he was. He touched its edges in the stopped world and it pushed back with the automatic resistance of something that had been in its location for a long time and considered the location home. By the 5th night he had mapped it completely. By the 7th he had found the attachment points, the places where the fragment had anchored itself to his own magic, had woven itself into the tissue of his power the way a vine grows into stone, sending roots between the gaps. By the 9th night he understood all of it, and he sat in stop time with the golden silence around him and the between space full of the quality of his own power, and he began the work. He pulled. Not physically, there was no physical mechanism here. He pulled with the root of himself, with the stop-time essence that DIO had pressed into him when he was 4 years old and which had become the fundamental note of everything he was. He pulled with that and the fragment pulled back and the resistance was enormous. It was Tom Riddle's will, even in fragment, even diminished, and Tom Riddle's will had never been small. The pain arrived on the third pull, deep and specific, the pain of something being removed from a location it had occupied for too long. He pulled again. The fragment tore free on the 8th pull. He felt it leave, felt the space it left, which was larger than he'd expected, an absence the shape of something he had never not had, and for a moment the absence was so complete that he thought he'd broken something. The stopped world flickered. The golden silence went to static. Then his own power rushed in and filled the space, and the static resolved, and Harry sat in the stopped world and breathed and the scar on his forehead, for the first time in his life, was just a scar. He held the fragment in stop time, the sole piece, visible here in the between space as a dim red light, pulsing with the last energy of something that was running out of time to exist, and he looked at it. He held it the way you hold something that was once part of you even if it was never supposed to be, and he acknowledged it, because acknowledgement was honest. Then he pushed it out of stop time into nothing. Into the between space that was not a space and not a time, the gap between moments, the place where even Voldemort's architecture couldn't maintain itself. The red light went out. Harry let time go. He sat in his room in the dark, and the scar was a scar, and the air in the room was ordinary air, and outside the window the street was quiet, and he was exactly what he was without addition. He went to sleep and slept without dreaming for the first time in 15 years. The remaining Horcruxes took the better part of a year. He moved through them with the same energy he brought to everything, not urgency, but purpose, which was different. Urgency was reactive. Purpose was chosen. The locket was at Grimmauld Place, in a cabinet that Creature guarded with the fierce loyalty of someone whose entire emotional world had contracted to a single object. Harry sat with Creature and listened to the elf tell the story of Regulus Black. The second time someone had gone back to correct their own mistake, Harry thought, the second time someone had chosen the harder thing after the easier one had turned out to be wrong. He listened to all of it, and then he said, Regulus would have wanted it destroyed. Creature looked at him with the ancient, watery eyes of a creature that had been alive longer than most of the people in Harry's life and had been treated, for most of that time, as less than furniture. He looked at Harry the way he hadn't looked at anyone in years, with the evaluating suspicion of something that knows what recognition feels like and has stopped expecting it. Master Regulus was a good wizard, Creature said. I know, Harry said. Will you help me? Creature helped him. The locket was destroyed in stop time, the fragment inside it pulled apart with the same technique as the diary and the scar, and Harry thanked Creature afterward with the directness of someone who meant it, and Creature made a sound that was the closest an elderly house elf gets to being moved. The cup at Gringotts required a level of planning that Hermione was invaluable for, not the breaking in, which Harry could have managed alone in stop time, but the extraction without triggering the multiplying curses on the Lestrange vault's contents, which was a magical engineering problem that required someone who had read the relevant source material and retained all of it. They went together, Harry and Hermione, in the autumn of his 5th year, when Umbridge was making Hogwarts miserable in the background and Harry was largely indifferent to her existence in the specific way he was indifferent to obstacles that didn't have the scale to register as obstacles. They got the cup. Hermione disarmed the multiplication curse with a technique she had found in a text on countercurse architecture that Harry had found for her in a second-hand shop in Knockturn Alley. Harry destroyed the fragment on the cart ride out, which made the cart ride extremely unpleasant because even in stop time a soul fragment in its own container was harder than one embedded in a person, and it took longer than anything else had, and he was exhausted in a way he wasn't used to by the time they operated out of the vicinity of Diagon Alley. Hermione looked at him. Are you all right? Give me a minute, he said. She gave him the minute, standing beside him on a London side street in the November cold, and then he straightened and said, done, and she let out a breath that said she'd been holding it since they'd entered the bank. For down, she said. Diadem and Nagini, Harry said. The diadem was in the room of requirement, which he found in his 5th year with the kind of patience that the room rewarded, asking for what he actually needed rather than what he thought he needed, which was a distinction that took 3 attempts. He found it in a vast space full of the accumulated lost things of centuries, sitting on the head of a stone bust with the quiet patience of an object that had been misplaced so long it had stopped expecting to be found. He destroyed it without ceremony and walked out of the room and went to Charms. In the spring of his 6th year, Harry told Ron. He had told Hermione everything, incrementally, over years, each piece landing in the architecture of her understanding and being integrated with the careful thoroughness she brought to everything. Ron had been given selected information, enough to be useful, enough to be honest, not always the full picture, because Harry had learned early that Ron's loyalty was not conditional on complete information but that his anxiety was proportional to it, and his anxiety made him less effective. But spring of 6th year was different. They were 17 and the war had been building openly since the graveyard and Voldemort's public return and the Ministry's eventual reluctant acknowledgement, and Dumbledore had been working through his own leads on the Horcruxes, and Harry had been working through his, and they had been operating in parallel in a way that worked but was not, Harry knew, sustainable. He told Ron in the common room on a Wednesday evening. The fire was low and it was late and Hermione was there, and Harry told Ron the whole thing from the beginning, the fragment in the scar, the Horcruxes, the night at the graveyard with Voldemort's fascinating, all of it. Ron listened with the focused attention he had when the situation called for it, the volume dialed down, the natural energy redirected into processing. When Harry finished, Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you've already destroyed 4 of them?" "Yes," Harry said. "And the scar is sorted?" "Yes." "And you're going after Nagini last?" "Yes." Ron nodded slowly. "And nobody except Hermione has known any of this?" "And Dumbledore?" "Since last summer." Another nod. "And you didn't tell me because telling you everything at the beginning wouldn't have been kind," Harry said. "Some of it, the scar, especially, needed time to work through before it became information rather than a crisis." Ron looked at him for a long moment. It was a complicated look, there was hurt in it, genuine, the hurt of someone who valued being trusted and had not been fully trusted. There was also something else, the other side of the hurt, the thing underneath it, the look of someone putting together a picture and seeing how many pieces were already in place and understanding that the puzzle had been in better hands than he'd known. "You've been handling all of this," Ron said. "The whole time?" "Yes," Harry said. "And you're fine?" "I'm fine." "You're always fine." "I know," Harry said. "I know that's annoying." Ron looked at him and then made the sound he made, the exhale that was most of a laugh, and shook his head. "It's not annoying," he said. "It's just, you're the most ridiculous person I've ever met, you know that?" "I've been told," Harry said. "By who?" "Hermione. Regularly." "She's right," Ron said, and that was the end of the hurt, because Ron had always resolved things by deciding rather than by processing, which Harry had always thought was one of his better qualities. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay close," Harry said. "When it ends fast, and I want people I trust nearby." "I'll be there," Ron said. "I know," Harry said. "Dumbledore died in June." Harry was not there when it happened. He heard about it from McGonagall's voice, which had the quality of stone cracking, the specific sound of someone who has held themselves together for years and has found the thing that tests the last joint of that structure. He heard it and he stood in the corridor outside McGonagall's office and looked at the wall for a while. He thought about the evening in his room at Privet Drive. About the apology. About don't do it anymore. About Dumbledore setting his plan down. He thought about a man who had been trying, in his very complicated and very controlling way, to save everyone. Who had been the thing standing between the wizarding world and Voldemort for 50 years, and who had been carrying that alone for most of it, because the weight of that kind of responsibility tends to convince the person carrying it that sharing it would be more dangerous than bearing it. He was not without fault. He had treated Harry as a variable in an equation. He had made decisions that had cost Harry years of his life. He had been wrong about important things in important ways. He had also been, at his core, someone who chose love as his method even when strategy would have been simpler, and that was not nothing, and Harry stood in the corridor and acknowledged it. Then he went to find Snape. The final confrontation was at Hogwarts, because of course it was. Everything in Harry's life had come back to Hogwarts eventually, the school that had been the first place he belonged, the first building that had held him without apology, that had made space for him in a way that wasn't about cupboards and bolts and someone else's conditions. Voldemort came with his army in the grey light of the small hours, and the castle shook with the impact of spells against its protections, and inside its walls the people who had decided to be there made their decisions and took their positions with the serious dignity of people who understand what they are defending. Harry had been awake since midnight. He had spent the hour before the attack moving through the castle in stop time, mapping the approach, noting the positions of Voldemort's forces and the lay of the grounds. He had found Nagini's location. She was with Voldemort, as expected, wrapped around his shoulders with the possessive weight of the last piece of something that had been constructed over 40 years. He had thought about Neville. He had thought about Neville specifically, because Neville had spent 6 years becoming someone, and the becoming had been gradual enough that you only saw it fully when you looked at the distance between who he'd been and who he was, the nervous boy on the train who'd lost his toad, and the young man standing in the courtyard with Gryffindor's sword in his hand and his chin level and his eyes clear. Some of the becoming had happened in Harry's vicinity, and Harry knew the role that proximity played in it and was, in the private arithmetic he kept, glad. He told Neville about Nagini. "She has to die," Harry said. "Before the end. If she's still alive at the end, he can still come back." Neville looked at the sword in his hand. "You're going after him now?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." Neville held the sword and looked at Harry with the directness of someone who has stopped requiring that the world make sense before he acts in it. "I'll get the snake," he said. "I know," Harry said. "That's why I told you." Neville nodded. Then he said, "You're going to come back." It was not a question. It was something more demanding than a question. It was Neville stating a requirement, with the quiet force of someone who doesn't ask for much and means it when he does. "Yes," Harry said. "Good," Neville said. "Because you promised." "I didn't actually, 4th year," Neville said. "The night of the first task. You said you'd be fine. You've said it every time. That's a promise." Harry looked at him. Something moved in his chest, the warmth that arrived sometimes when he was with these people, his people, the ones who had found him and stayed regardless. He had spent years deciding how much of himself to let in, how much to let through, and he had never fully resolved the question, and standing in the corridor with Neville Longbottom and the sword of Gryffindor he found that the question had resolved itself somewhere along the way without asking him. "It's a promise," Harry said. He went to find Voldemort. The Great Hall had been a battlefield and was now the space after one, the particular quality of a room where large violent things have happened and the air is still carrying the record of them. Voldemort was at the far end and around him his forces were thinning, because Neville had gotten the snake. Harry had felt it, at the edge of his awareness, the snap of the Horcrux connection severing, the last anchor gone, and without the anchor the confidence of Voldemort's army was discovering its actual load-bearing capacity. Harry walked through the hall. People moved aside. His people and Voldemort's people both. The crowd parted not because he asked it to but because of the quality of his movement, the absolute absence of hesitation, the sense of someone who has decided where they are going and is going there and the intervening space is not a consideration. Hermione was somewhere to his left. Ron to his right. Neville behind him with the sword. McGonagall and the professors in a line across the hall. Voldemort saw him coming. The red eyes tracked him from across the hall and Voldemort went still, the stillness of a man who is recalculating, who had arranged the night around the certainty that this moment would not arrive, who had believed, had genuinely believed, that the scar fragment made Harry either his property or his liability. He had not accounted for the possibility of someone simply removing it. "You destroyed them," Voldemort said. "All of them," Harry said. He stopped 15 feet away. The hall was very quiet now, the quiet of a large space full of people who have decided to listen. "It's just you." "Just me," Voldemort said, and his voice had the quality of something very large acknowledging that the foundation has moved, is not nothing. "No," Harry said. "You're not nothing. You were exceptional once. You were genuinely brilliant and genuinely courageous in your own way and genuinely extraordinary, and everything you did with that was wrong." He paused. "Not wrong like a mistake. Wrong like a choice, made clearly, maintained consistently, that led here." Voldemort looked at him. The red eyes moved across Harry's face the way they had in the graveyard, with the quality of something encountering a thing that doesn't categorize correctly. "You came here to lecture me," he said. "I came here to end this," Harry said. "The lecture is free." "You're not afraid of dying," Voldemort said, and the red eyes had narrowed, he was running the calculation, still, always, looking for the angle. "You were never afraid of dying. That was the one thing I couldn't understand. Every human being is afraid of death. It is the fundamental. I live in stop time," Harry said. "I exist in the gap between moments. I am the space between 1 second and the next." He let it land. I was afraid of things when I was 4 years old in a cupboard and something came to me in the dark and changed me. I have not been afraid of anything since. Not because I'm brave. Because I understood what I was and fear didn't have anywhere to anchor. Voldemort was very still. You built your whole architecture on fear of death, Harry said. Every Horcrux. Every choice. Everything you became. You were so afraid of the end that you destroyed your own soul trying to get past it. He looked at him with something that was not pity and not contempt but something older and sadder and more final. You didn't have to be afraid. Nobody does. But you chose it, and you built a religion out of it, and now it ends. You can't kill me, Voldemort said, and the voice had dropped, had gone to the root of itself, the place beneath the performance and the resonance. You've never killed anyone. No, Harry said. And I won't start now. Voldemort blinked. Harry stopped time. The hall froze. 400 people suspended in a single moment, every wand, every spell mid-cast, every face caught between expressions. Voldemort frozen mid-movement, his wand half-raised, the red eyes arrested in the moment before they understood what was about to happen. Harry walked forward. He crossed the 15 feet and stood in front of Voldemort, close, in the golden silence, and looked at his face. This was the face Tom Riddle had built for himself, the nose gone, the skin gone to white, the features rearranged into something that had decided it was past the need for humanity's approval. He looked at it and thought about the orphan underneath and the choices above and the long road between. He reached into the stopped world with the root of himself, the between space, the DIO-shaped inheritance, the gift from a cold hand in a dark cupboard, and he found the last piece of Voldemort's soul. Not a Horcrux. Not a fragment. The whole of it, the main body, what remained of Tom Riddle's soul after years of division, and it was dim now, very dim, the dim of something that has given away more than it can sustain and is running on the remainder. He didn't destroy it. He understood something, in the between space, that he hadn't been sure of until this moment: destruction was not the move. A soul destroyed in the conventional sense wasn't gone, it was just unmoored, scattered into the world in a way that could, theoretically, eventually, be gathered. That was the architecture Voldemort had been relying on. The soul couldn't be annihilated, it could only be relocated. But in stop time, in the between space, in the gap that was Harry's specific and untransferable territory, things could be placed in the permanent between. Not destroyed. Fixed. Held in the amber of a stopped moment that never resumed. He had worked this out over the winter. He had discussed it with no one because there was no one who would know whether it was theoretically sound, and the only way to test it was to do it, and doing it would take everything he had in the doing. He gathered the dim remainder of Tom Riddle's soul and he placed it in the between space and he stopped it there, in the gap between one moment and the next, where time didn't run and never would, and the soul was not destroyed and was not freed and was not scattered, it was simply still. Permanently. Irrevocably. Stopped. He felt the effort of it, felt it in every part of himself, the full depth of what DIO had given him pressed into a single application, and for a moment the stopped world flickered badly and he felt the walls of the between space flex, and for one fraction of a second he was not sure the architecture was going to hold. It held. He let time go. Voldemort collapsed. Not dramatically, there was no explosion, no dark cloud, no theatrical dissolution. He simply folded downward, the puppet with the strings cut, and the body that hit the floor was already becoming what bodies become when whatever was animating them has been somewhere permanent, and the red eyes were open and empty and ordinary. The hall was silent. Not the silence of shock, not the held-breath silence of people waiting for the next thing to happen. The silence of completion. The silence of a story that has run to its last sentence and the sentence is finished. Harry stood over what had been Voldemort and looked at it for a moment, and then he turned around. The hall was full of faces, his year, the years above and below, the professors, the people who had come to fight and the people who had survived the fighting. Hermione was crying in the specific way she cried when she was both sad and relieved simultaneously, which was the efficient Hermione approach to complex emotional situations. Ron was standing with his arm around her and looking at Harry with the expression of someone who has been along for a journey that ended somewhere he wasn't sure he believed they'd get to. Neville was standing at the back with the sword and a cut on his jaw and the expression of someone who has done what was needed and is at peace with that. Harry looked at all of them. He looked at the hall where the candles had stopped on his first night, where he had been sorted by a hat that didn't have a column for what he was, where he had eaten and studied and grown into the thing he was now and which he had been building towards since he was 4 years old, in a dark cupboard with a cold hand against his head and the air turning the color of between. He walked to Hermione. She looked up at him and he looked at her, properly, with all of it, the years of letters and library corners and her hand on his arm in corridors and the graveyard and Gringotts and the winter he'd spent working on the scar and all the mornings after and all the conversations and the way her mind moved, which was the thing he had loved first and most, the mind that moved fast enough to follow his. "Done," he said. She laughed, which was also crying. "You could have led with that." "I needed to see your face first," he said, and it was possibly the most honestly personal thing he had ever said out loud, and he said it the way he said everything, without performance, without hesitation, just directly, because it was true and truth was the only currency he'd ever found worth spending. She looked at him and the thing that had been building in the space between them for years was fully present in the look, and neither of them said anything else about it because they didn't need to. Some things were more true before they were spoken. Ron said, from 3 feet away, "I'm standing right here." "I know," Harry said. "I'm just saying," Ron said, and his voice had the slight hoarseness of someone who'd been doing a lot of things tonight that required the quality of person he'd been becoming. "I'm standing right here, and if you two are going to have a moment, I'm allowed to have a feeling about that." "What feeling?" Hermione asked. "The feeling," Ron said, with dignity, "of someone who called this in 3rd year and has never been acknowledged for it." "You didn't call it in 3rd year," Hermione said. "I absolutely, Ron," Harry said. "What?" "Thank you," Harry said. "For all of it." Ron looked at him and the dignity cracked and something simpler and truer was underneath it, and he nodded once, the way Harry nodded when something was too large for more words. "Yeah," he said. "Of course." It was Neville who suggested the roof. Not in words, he just appeared beside Harry sometime in the first light of morning and tilted his head upward, the gesture of someone who has spent enough time in a person's company to know when they need altitude, and Harry followed him up the stairs and through the door at the top of the astronomy tower and onto the flat expanse of stone in the early dawn. The 4 of them stood on the roof of Hogwarts in the first light of a June morning, Harry and Hermione and Ron and Neville, and looked at the grounds below and the lake and the forest and the sky that was doing what skies do at dawn, which is perform the entire spectrum in order, dark to light, every shade of transition available. The castle beneath them was quiet. The battle had ended and the injured were being tended and the dead were being attended to with the serious gentleness of people who understood what that meant, and all of that was real and mattered and was going to need to be dealt with, and all of it would be dealt with, and this was not that moment. This was the moment before that moment. Harry stood at the edge of the roof and looked at the horizon and let the stop-time hum in his blood settle into its resting register, the quiet, constant note of what he was, present and undemanding, the sound of a nature that had made its peace with itself. He thought about DIO. About a man in a coat on a Surrey street in 1984, who had come to a cupboard for no reason he had ever explained and found a 4-year-old who looked at him without fear and had decided, for reasons that remained his own, to give the boy something that could not be taken away. He thought about cold hands and the color of between and the way the clocks had stopped on Privet Drive and the moth that had resumed its orbit of the lamp. He did not know if DIO was alive. He did not know if a vampire with stop time could die in the conventional sense, and the honest answer was that it was probably his own answer too, and he had stopped trying to resolve the question and started simply carrying it, the open question of what he was and whether there was a name for it and whether a name was something he needed. He was Harry Potter. He had been the god of frozen time since he was 4 years old. He had grown up in a cupboard and into something the hat didn't have a column for, and he had destroyed a Dark Lord's contingency plan piece by piece with the patient efficiency of someone who had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to get there. He had Hermione beside him, whose mind was the best thing he knew, who had chosen him over and over in the specific way of people who make the choice consciously rather than arriving at it by default. He had Ron, who had come back from every distance and would continue to come back and whose loyalty was not conditional and never had been. He had Neville, who had been becoming someone for 6 years and had arrived. He had Hogwarts below him, which had always been his first home and was his home still. He had Frost, who had chosen him in an Ollery before he'd chosen anything. He had a scar on his forehead that was just a scar. He had stopped time. He stopped it now, the full, deep, golden stop, the world arresting in the first light of morning, the lake frozen mid-ripple, the birds frozen mid-wing, the smoke from the castle chimneys frozen in its upward curl, the clouds motionless, the trees motionless, the whole vast sleeping world suspended in the amber of a single moment. He stood in it. He let himself stand in it without agenda, not practicing, not working, not resolving anything. Just standing in the stopped morning in the company of his people and the castle and the sky that had been going to light without his help and would go on doing so. He was 15 years old and had lived more of his life in stopped time than in moving time, and the between space was home the way Hogwarts was home, the way Hermione's voice was home, the way Frost's weight on his arm was home. He held the stop for a long time. Longer than he'd ever held it for no reason. Then he let time go. The lake resumed its rippling. The birds found their wing beats. The smoke curled upward and the clouds moved on and the morning continued its patient work of becoming day, and Hermione turned to look at him and the look was clear and full and unguarded and everything in it was visible. "What next?" she asked. Harry looked at the horizon. The sun was nearly up, the edge of it visible now, the specific orange of a sun that has been doing this for 4 billion years and has developed a certain confidence in the repetition. "Whatever we want," he said. The sun came up. He watched it, and the world moved, and he let it move, and it was enough, all of it, all of them, the morning and the castle and the people beside him and the stop-time hum in his blood and the between space waiting like a room he could always go back to. It was enough. It was, for the first time in his life, enough. End.